Close your eyes and imagine stepping back into the year 1348, where the only thing on the agenda is navigating the slow, quiet atmosphere of a plague city. Let the droning, mundane descriptions of medicinal herbs and dampened alleyways wash over you, calming your thoughts and guiding you gently toward a peaceful, boring night's sleep. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here, the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. The first thing that hit you when you opened your shutters in 1348. Florence wasn't the sight of the plague carts rumbling through the pre-dawn streets, nor was it the eerie silence where there should have been the calls of merchants and the chatter of early risers. Was the smell, even before the first rays of sunlight crept over the terracotta rooftops, before you could see the devastation that had transformed your once vibrant city into a charnel house. Your nose told you everything you needed to know about the hell that had descended upon your world. The odor of death hung over the city like an invisible fog, mixing with the everyday reek of medieval life that had always been there, creating a miasma so thick and complex that it seemed almost tangible, as if you could reach out and touch the very air itself. On a normal morning, back in those days that now seemed like a distant dream from another lifetime, you'd smell the bread baking from the baker's ovens 3 streets over, that wonderful yeasty aroma that promised fresh loaves and the continuation of ordinary life. It would mix with the sharp, almost acidic tang of horse manure from the stables, the earthy smell of hay and straw, and the sour, pungent notes of the tannery by the river where animal hides were transformed into leather through processes so noxious that tanners were required to live on the outskirts of cities. These were familiar smells, the ordinary background odor of medieval urban life that you'd grown up with, that your parents and grandparents had known, smells that spoke of commerce and community and the rhythms of daily existence. But during the plague, those familiar scents were drowned beneath something far more sinister. Something that made even the worst normal city smells seem almost pleasant by comparison. The sweet, cloying, overwhelming stench of decomposition. It seemed to seep through every crack in your wooden window frame, penetrating the very walls of your home like some invisible demon seeking entry. Medieval noses were already accustomed to what we in the modern world would consider unbearable conditions. There was no sewage system in these cities, no underground pipes carrying waste away to treatment facilities. No indoor plumbing that whisked away human waste with the pull of a chain. Instead, chamber pots were used throughout the night, and in the morning they were simply emptied into the streets from upper-story windows, sometimes with a shouted warning of gardes low, but often without even that courtesy. This created rivers of waste that flowed down the gutters, mixing with rainwater when it rained, creating a perpetual soup of human and animal excrement that lined every street. Dogs, pigs, and rats fed on whatever they could find in this mess, while children played in streets where the very ground was saturated with filth. The smell was constant, a baseline odor of ammonia, sulfur compounds, and organic decay that medieval people simply learned to live with, the way we might grow accustomed to living near a factory or a highway. But the plague added layers of horror that even hardened medieval citizens. People who had never known what it meant to live in truly clean conditions couldn't ignore or become accustomed to. The smell of the plague dead was different from anything they'd experienced before. It was the smell of mass death, of bodies decomposing faster than they could be buried, of a disease so virulent and so widespread that it overwhelmed every system, every custom, every tradition that had previously governed how the dead were treated. The sweet smell of decay, which any medieval person would have encountered occasionally when passing a dead animal or attending a funeral, became the dominant odor of the entire city, present everywhere, inescapable, no matter where you went or what you did. When you cracked open your shutters on that morning and you hesitated before doing so, because you knew what awaited you, the smell rolled into your room like a physical wave. It was layered and complex, a horrible symphony of odors that your brain struggled to process. There was the baseline sweetness of decomposition, that sickly floral note that human decay produces in its middle stages, mixed with sharper notes of putrefaction. the result of bacterial action breaking down proteins into sulfur compounds and other volatile chemicals. Underneath that was the smell of the buboes themselves, those horrific swellings in the groin, armpits, and neck where lymph nodes swelled to the size of eggs or even oranges, often rupturing and leaking pus and blood. The smell of infected tissue, of gangrenous flesh, still attached to living bodies, had a particular character. It was both sweet and foul simultaneously, with a hint of something metallic from the blood, and something indescribably rotten from the bacterial infection. This smell came not from one or two sources, but from hundreds, perhaps thousands of people throughout the city who were in various stages of plague infection. Some were still alive, suffering in their homes, their buboes weeping, and their bodies racked with fever and delirium. Others had died during the night, their bodies lying in their beds or collapsed on their floors, beginning the process of decomposition in the summer heat. Still others had been dead for days, lying in sealed houses or waiting in piles for the plague carts to collect them, their bodies bloating and releasing gases, their skin turning colors that no living flesh should ever be. The psychological impact of this smell cannot be overstated. Modern people, even those who work in medicine or forensics and encounter death regularly, do so in controlled environments with ventilation systems, protective equipment, and the knowledge that they can leave and return to clean, fresh air. But in plague-era Florence, there was no escape. The smell was everywhere, all the time, day and night, waking and sleeping. It penetrated your clothes, your hair, your very skin. You tasted it in your food, because smell is so intimately connected to taste. You smelled it in your dreams, because your brain couldn't process anything else. It became the backdrop to every moment of your existence, a constant reminder that death was all around you, that you might be next, that the world as you knew it was ending. People described feeling nauseated constantly, not just from the smell itself, but from the anxiety and fear it provoked. Some lost their appetite entirely and wasted away even without catching the plague. Others ate and drank compulsively, trying to fill themselves with something, anything, that might crowd out the awareness of the smell and what it meant. The smell invaded your consciousness in ways that sights and sounds couldn't. You could close your eyes, cover your ears, but you couldn't stop breathing, and every breath brought with it the reminder of the apocalypse unfolding around you. The morning air had a particular quality during the plague that made the smell even worse than it would be later in the day. At night, the temperature dropped, and the cool air settled close to the ground, trapping odors in a layer near the street level. As the sun rose and began to warm the air, it stirred up all these accumulated smells, releasing them in an almost visible cloud that rose through the city. The morning mist and fog, common in Florence and other cities near water, acted like a carrier for the odor molecules, holding them suspended in the air and delivering them directly to your nose with every breath. Observers of the time wrote about this evil mist or plague fog, believing that the visible vapor itself was the cause of the disease, when in reality it was simply carrying the smell of death that already surrounded them. This miasma theory of disease, the belief that bad air caused illness, was the dominant medical understanding of the time, and the smell of the plague seemed to confirm it. How could something that smelled so terrible not be the cause of sickness and death? The doctors of the era didn't understand germ theory, didn't know about the bacteria Yersinia pestis that actually caused plague, didn't know about the fleas and rats that carried it. All they knew was that the air smelled like death, and people were dying, and the connection seemed obvious. So they tried desperately to combat the smell, believing that if they could purify the air, they could stop the disease, not realizing that the smell was a symptom, not a cause. Your bedroom, which you'd hoped might offer some sanctuary from the horrors outside, provided little relief. Even with the shutters closed all night, the smell had crept in through the gaps in the wood, through the spaces around the door, through every tiny opening in the medieval construction that was never designed to be airtight. Your bedding, which couldn't be washed frequently because water had to be carried by hand from wells or the river, and heating it for washing was enormously labor-intensive, had absorbed the ambient smell of the city. Your wool blankets, your straw-stuffed mattress, your few items of clothing hanging on pegs, everything carried the odor. Some people tried burning herbs in their bedrooms at night, rosemary, lavender, sage, creating bundles called strewing herbs that they'd light and let smolder in bowls, hoping the fragrant smoke would drive out the bad air. But this just added another layer to the smell, creating a mixture of herbal smoke and death that was, if anything, even more unsettling than the death smell alone. The smoke made your eyes water and your throat raw, and in the morning, everything would smell of smoke and ash, with the underlying death odor still present, just temporarily masked. Some wealthy families could afford to burn expensive incense, frankincense, and myrrh imported at great cost from the East. But even this, which in normal times would have seemed wonderfully exotic and luxurious, became associated with death and terror during the plague years. The smell of church incense, which should have been comforting and holy, became instead a reminder of all the funeral masses being held, all the last rites being administered, all the prayers being offered for souls departing this world in unprecedented numbers. As you stood at your window that morning, looking out over the city you'd known all your life, but which now seemed transformed into something from a nightmare, you realized that your sense of smell had become both curse and warning system. The smell told you things that your eyes couldn't see: which houses held the dead, which streets to avoid, how close the plague was to your own doorstep. You'd learned to read the gradients of odor like a map, knowing that a sudden intensification of the sweet smell meant a fresh death nearby, that a particular sour note indicated a house where plague victims were still alive but suffering, that the sharper smell of lime meant the gravediggers had been at work. This knowledge came at a terrible price: the constant assault on your senses, the inability to ever forget, even for a moment, the horror that surrounded you. Some people tried wrapping cloth around their faces, soaking it in vinegar or rosewater or wine, anything that might filter or mask the smell. But breathing through cloth was difficult, especially in the summer heat, and the smell still got through. Others held pomanders to their noses, constantly small perforated balls made of silver or gold for the wealthy, or simple cloth bags for the poor, filled with aromatic substances like cloves, cinnamon, musk, and ambergris. These provided some relief, but they also became intensely associated with the plague era, so that even years later, the smell of cloves might trigger terrible memories in survivors. The morning awakening during the plague wasn't just a physical experience, it was a spiritual and emotional crucible, a moment when you had to gather the courage to face another day in hell, knowing that the first thing to assault you wouldn't be the sights of suffering or the sounds of grief, but the overwhelming, inescapable, terrible smell that announced, before you could see anything else, that the plague still reigned and that survival was far from certain. Stepping out your door meant walking into a wall of competing stenches that hit you with almost physical force, a barrage of olfactory horror that made the smell in your bedroom seem almost mild by comparison. The threshold between your home and the street represented a boundary between the merely terrible and the truly unbearable. Crossing it required a kind of courage that we in the modern world can barely imagine. The cobblestones beneath your feet were slick with something you didn't want to identify too closely. A mixture of overnight rain that had done nothing to cleanse the streets, but had instead just redistributed the filth. Animal waste from horses, donkeys, and dogs that still moved through the city in reduced numbers. Rotting vegetables and spoiled food from yesterday's market, tossed into the street or trampled underfoot. And the bodily fluids of those who'd collapsed in the street during the night, victims of the plague, trying to reach help or flee the city, or simply find somewhere to die that wasn't in their homes. The medieval street was never a clean place. It was where waste went, where animals lived and died. But during the plague, it became something almost indescribable, a layer of biological horror that covered every surface and created an ecosystem of decay that fed on itself and grew worse with each passing day. The city's pigs, normally roaming free as living garbage disposals, had begun to thin out dramatically. Some had been slaughtered for food as livestock supplies dwindled, farmers dying or too afraid to enter. Other pigs had died from eating contaminated waste, contracting diseases, or becoming sick enough to die. The ones that remained were in a feeding frenzy unlike anything seen before, turning even the strongest stomachs. Pigs eating human waste was nothing new, but pigs eating human flesh crossed a psychological boundary that medieval people, despite their higher tolerance for disturbing things, found deeply unsettling. The pigs themselves began to smell different, carrying the odor of what they'd been feeding on, creating yet another layer in the complex olfactory landscape of the plague city. Your neighbor's house, shuttered tight for 3 days, had begun to emit an unmistakable odor, a smell that made you gag, even though you'd thought you'd become hardened to the smell of death. This was the unmistakable odor of human decay, concentrated and intensified inside a closed space. Inside, you knew, an entire family lay dead, the merchant father, the mother, 3 children. You'd heard their screams and moans for 2 days before silence fell, heard prayers and weeping, Now there was only silence and that smell, seeping through the walls, announcing what had happened within. Nobody dared enter to remove the bodies and perform the proper burial rites that every Christian deserved. The priest had fled the city, joining the exodus of religious officials who prioritized their own lives. This abandonment by the clergy was one of the most traumatic aspects of the plague for medieval people. To die without last rites, without confession, without assurance for your soul, this was a terror. And so the bodies lay in the houses, and the smell grew, and people walked past quickly, trying not to think that this could be their house next, their family lying dead with no one to care. The morning fog that rolled in from the Arno River created a particularly nightmarish effect, trapping all these smells close to the ground in a layer perhaps 6 or 8 feet thick. Walking through the streets meant moving through what witnesses described as an evil mist that seemed almost solid enough to see, almost thick enough to cut with a knife. The fog didn't just carry the smells, it intensified them, held them suspended in the air at nose height, delivered them directly and unavoidably to your respiratory system with every breath you took. People emerging into this morning fog would often retch immediately, their bodies rebelling against the assault. Some people vomited in the streets, adding yet another component to the mix of smells, creating a feedback loop where the smell made you sick, and being sick created more smell. The streets echoed with the sounds of people coughing, gagging, retching, trying desperately to clear their throats. But there was no clearing it, because the source was everywhere, all around, in every direction. The color of the morning light itself seemed affected by the plague, dimmer, more sickly, tinted with yellow or green hues that made everything look diseased, whether reality or perception. The smell and the strange light combined to create a sensory experience that felt apocalyptic, like the end of the world itself, which in many ways it was the end of the medieval world. Walking through the streets at sunrise during the plague was like walking through a vision of hell, and the smell was your constant reminder that this wasn't a nightmare from which you'd wake. The architecture of medieval cities made the smell problem worse in ways that broader streets might not have. Buildings constructed right up against each other, with streets so narrow that 2 carts could barely pass, overhanging upper stories that blocked light and air circulation. This meant that smells became trapped. Certain courtyards and alleys became concentrated zones of stench where the smell was magnified. You learned quickly which routes through the city were more bearable and which were to be avoided, knowledge that was literally life and death, because spending too much time in the worst-smelling areas meant breathing in more of what medieval people believed was plague-causing miasma. The irony, which they couldn't have known, was that the smell itself wasn't the danger. It was the fleas on the rats that thrived in the same filthy conditions that produced the smell. The few people you encountered on the streets moved quickly, purposefully, wrapped in protection. Some had cloth wrapped around their faces multiple times, soaked in vinegar or wine or rosewater, creating bulky masks that made them look inhuman, like strange creatures from a bestiary. Others carried small bundles of burning herbs, creating personal clouds of smoke they walked within, breathing the aromatic fumes instead of the ambient air. Still others carried sponges soaked in powerful substances, camphor, which had a sharp, penetrating smell, vinegar, whose acid temps cut through other smells, or even strong alcohol, which some people breathed in constantly, getting drunk in the process. Finding that the inebriation made the horror more bearable, the smell of these protective measures added yet more layers to the already overwhelming olfactory environment. Sharp vinegar, herbal smoke, mixing with the sweet smell of death, the sour smell of waste, the metallic smell of blood, all of it combining into something that no single word could describe, a whole vocabulary of smell. The animals remaining in the city added their own contributions to the smellscape. Horses and donkeys stood in their stables producing enormous quantities of manure that wasn't being cleaned out as regularly as it should have been. Stable workers were dying or fleeing. The smell of horse urine, which is particularly pungent and ammonia-rich, mixed with horse sweat, and the distinctive odor of horse manure, less offensive than human waste, but still strong. Dogs, including the packs of strays that roamed the cities, had their own smell, made worse by the fact that they were often feeding on things they shouldn't, including human remains. The dead dogs themselves, which littered the streets in increasing numbers, added another note to the symphony of decay. Cats, which might have helped control the rat population, were often killed due to superstition, creating a tragic irony where one of the animals that might have helped was eliminated, allowing the actual disease vectors the rats to multiply unchecked. The smell of dead cats, distinct from dead dogs or humans, each species producing its own variation, all of them contributing to the overwhelming odor that made the streets almost unnavigable. For anyone with a functioning sense of smell and any remaining sensitivity to human suffering, walking toward the town square in the strengthening morning light, you encountered one of the few remaining plague doctors making his rounds. His appearance was one of the most terrifying sights of the entire era, figure that seemed to belong more to nightmares than to waking reality. The doctor's bird-like mask, with its long beak, gave him the appearance of some unholy hybrid between human and corvid. It became one of the most iconic and disturbing images associated with the Black Death, haunting European consciousness for centuries. But that bizarre beak, terrifying as it appeared, served a very specific purpose in the medical understanding of the time. It was designed to hold aromatic substances the doctor would breathe, creating a primitive gas mask based on the miasma theory. The smell emanating from the plague doctor was intense and complex, an olfactory defense against the plague. Unfortunately, it did nothing to protect him from fleas, but offered psychological comfort and made him impossible to ignore. Inside that long beak, packed with meticulous care, was a mixture of herbs, spices, and aromatic compounds. These represented the best medical thinking of the era on how to combat pestilence. Dried roses, believed to have purifying properties and associated with health, were crushed and placed in the beak's tip. Carnations, expensive and exotic, added their spicy sweet aroma, believed to drive away the corrupted air that caused disease. Fresh or dried mint provided a sharp, clean scent that cut through other odors. Depending on availability and preference, camphor, imported from Asia, added its distinctive penetrating odor, almost medicinal, clearing sinuses and demanding attention. Cloves, precious spice buds worth their weight in silver, contributed their warm, sweet, yet sharp aroma. This aroma was believed to have protective properties against disease. Myrrh, with ancient associations with death and burial, added its bitter, slightly smoky smell to the mixture. Laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, provided its characteristic odor and psychoactive effects. The opium would take the edge off psychological trauma, while the alcohol contributed to the beak's internal atmosphere. The exact proportions and additional ingredients varied from doctor to doctor, each having his own theory. Some added storax, a resin with a sweet vanilla-like smell. Others included benzoin, another resin with a balsamic odor. Ambergris, produced by sperm whales and highly valued, was added by wealthy doctors, contributing its earthy, marine, slightly fecal smell. Musk, from glands of the musk deer, added its powerful animalistic odor. Civet contributed its own intense musk-like smell. The doctors were creating the most powerful perfumes they could devise, operating on the theory that strong, pleasant smells would drive away the plague. They were wrong about the mechanism. The smell wasn't the danger, and pleasant smells didn't neutralize pathogenic bacteria. But the impulse was understandable, and the results were certainly noticeable. The plague doctor's robes contributed their own complex array of smells to the overall effect. These robes, typically made of heavy waxed leather or canvas, were designed to prevent the plague from penetrating to the doctor's body. The wax itself had a distinctive sweet, honey-like smell that was pleasant under normal circumstances, but it became overwhelming when applied in the thick layers needed to fully coat a long robe. The wax was often mixed with aromatic substances, lavender oil, rosemary oil, or other essential oils, creating a garment that smelled like a mobile garden or apothecary shop. The leather underneath added its own distinctive tannic odor of tanned hide. Over time, as the doctor wore these robes, they absorbed the smells of the plague itself, creating a strange and terrible mixture of protective aromatics and the very disease they were meant to ward against. The result was a garment that smelled simultaneously of the apothecary and the charnel house, of careful medical preparation and desperate human suffering. Some plague doctors went even further in their olfactory defenses, carrying censers that they would swing as they walked, creating clouds of fragrant smoke that followed them through the streets. These censers might contain frankincense, the classic church incense with its lemony piney smell. Myrrh, that other biblical incense, might be burned, adding its bittersweet, slightly medicinal smoke to the cloud. Some doctors burned combinations specifically designed for plague defense recipes that included sulfur and saltpeter. The smoke from these censers was thick and often colored frankincense. Smoke is white and almost opaque when dense. Walking behind a plague doctor, you'd move through these clouds of aromatic smoke. For just a moment, the smell of the plague would be replaced by the smell of burning incense, creating a brief respite that made the return of the death smell even more shocking by contrast. The psychological effect of these aromatic defenses on both the doctors themselves and the people they treated was significant and complex. For the doctors, the elaborate ritual of preparing the beak stuffing, waxing the robes, and loading the censers provided a sense of agency and control. They were doing something, taking action, using the best knowledge available to them to protect themselves while trying to help others. The smells they created were expensive and required effort to produce and maintain, which gave them value beyond their actual protective effect. When a doctor breathed in the concentrated aromatics of his beak while examining a patient, the intensity of those smells would dominate his olfactory system, at least partially blocking out the smell of the patient's infected buboes and the general reek of the plague house. This wasn't just physical comfort, it was psychological armor, a way of creating sensory distance from the horror of the disease, allowing the doctor to function when direct confrontation with the full sensory reality of plague might have been overwhelming. For patients and their families, the arrival of the plague doctor in his strange costume, surrounded by clouds of aromatic smoke and exotic smells, provided a different kind of comfort. This was expertise, authority, the medical profession in its most dramatic form. The very strangeness of the appearance and the intensity of the smells suggested special knowledge, powerful interventions, the possibility of cure. The beak itself was usually made of leather, though some doctors used metal or even glass for the beak portion, creating a rigid structure that extended 6 to 8 inches, or even a foot from the face. This beak had to be filled and refilled regularly, because the aromatic substances lost their potency over time. Each doctor had his own routine for this maintenance. Some refilled the beak every morning, some every few hours. The process of refilling involved carefully unstuffing the old material, which by now would be contaminated with whatever the doctor had been breathing. The smell of these used beak stuffings was distinctive. The original aromatics now mixed with human breath, moisture, and decay. Disposing of this material required care, as doctors believed it was now contaminated with plague miasma. Fresh material was then carefully prepared, often using a mortar and pestle to crush dried herbs and mix ingredients, creating aromatic clouds in the doctor's preparation room that was so intense that neighbors could smell them from the street. The economics of these aromatic defenses was significant in a society where most people struggled to afford basic necessities. The spices and aromatic substances that plague doctors packed into their beaks represented considerable wealth. A single filling of a plague doctor's beak might contain substances worth more than a common laborer would earn in a month or even a year. This meant that only physicians who could afford these materials, or who were subsidized by wealthy patrons or city governments, could maintain the full regalia. Lesser physicians had to make do with cheaper alternatives, local herbs instead of imported spices, vinegar-soaked sponges instead of elaborate beak apparatuses. This created a hierarchy of aromatic defense that paralleled the social hierarchy of the medical profession itself. And yet, regardless of this hierarchy, the protection they provided against the actual disease was essentially the same, which is to say, none at all. The fleas that carried Yersinia pestis were not deterred by pleasant smells or repelled by aromatic smoke. The lasting impact of the plague doctor's aromatic arsenal extended far beyond the plague years themselves. The associations formed between certain smells and the terror of the plague era meant that even decades or centuries later, certain scents could trigger traumatic memories. The smell of cloves, which might have been pleasant and exotic before the plague, became associated with death and medical futility. Frankincense and myrrh took on additional dark connotations. The very idea of using strong scents to ward off disease became embedded in European medical practice and folk medicine, persisting long after the plague had passed, and influencing everything from the development of actual antiseptics to the continued use of aromatic herbs in sick rooms. The plague doctors, walking through the streets in their bizarre costumes, surrounded by their clouds of aromatic smoke, their beaks stuffed with the world's most exotic substances, represented humanity's desperate attempt to fight an invisible enemy using the only weapons they understood: the power of smell to overwhelm and replace, to protect and purify. That these weapons were ultimately ineffective against the actual pathogen doesn't diminish the courage it took to don that costume and walk into plague houses day after day, or the ingenuity involved in creating such elaborate systems of olfactory defense. or the significance of the attempt itself, in a world where the very air seemed poisonous. The town square, which for centuries had been the beating heart of the city's commercial and social life, where merchants displayed their wares, and public announcements were made, and festivals were celebrated, and executions were carried out, and life in all its medieval intensity was concentrated into one central space, had been converted during the plague into something that would have been utterly unthinkable just months before a vast necropolis, a city of the dead occupying the very center of the city of the living. The transformation was both practical and profoundly disturbing, a necessity born of the fact that the traditional graveyards surrounding the churches had filled up completely within the first month of the plague's arrival, their capacity overwhelmed by death arriving at a rate that no one had imagined possible. The carefully maintained individual graves with their headstones and markers, the family plots where generations were laid to rest together, the entire system of Christian burial that had governed death for centuries, all of this collapsed under the weight of mass mortality. And so enormous pits had been dug right in the city center, in the square where just a year ago you might have bought fresh bread, or watched a traveling performer, or conducted business with a merchant from another city. These mass graves would eventually hold hundreds, or even thousands of bodies, and the smell that emanated from them was, quite simply, the worst smell that human beings can create. The smell of decomposition on a scale that defied the very concept of dignified death and reduced human remains to a biological problem that needed to be managed like garbage or sewage. The smell here defied description in any normal vocabulary of odor. To say it smelled of death or decomposition or decay is inadequate to the point of meaninglessness. Like saying the ocean is wet or the sun is bright, technically accurate, but conveying nothing of the actual experience. The pits were layered constructions, a horrific stratigraphy of bodies covered with thin layers of lime and dirt. Then more bodies, then more lime and dirt, building up over days and weeks into mounds that rose above the original ground level. The lime was supposed to help control decomposition, to act as a disinfectant, and to reduce the smell. And it did help, but only marginally, and the help it provided was completely inadequate to the scale of the problem. What the lime actually did, chemically, was to create a highly alkaline environment that inhibited some bacterial action while facilitating others, altered the decomposition process in ways that changed the specific compounds being released but didn't reduce the overall amount of odorous material, and created its own smell, the sharp caustic smell, and created its own smell, the sharp caustic smell of a calcic smell of calcic smell of smellsick smell of smell to a casic spell of kins sickle and sesic kin up of copepolas at bend up to cat in wig gollet off with pmens it bod was up with power with 12 wek look up whip up with a hat spat up to bar but wick up how to got what up works it dollar well small poop pascal Bas papust cost best beloved dog hello it's first that it's because the dirt covering was even less effective, serving mainly to hide the visual horror rather than contain the olfactory one. Gases from decomposition, methane, hydrogen sulfide, cadaverine, putrescine, and dozens of other volatile organic compounds, with names that sound like they belong in a chemistry textbook, but which translated into smells that belonged in descriptions of hell, bubbled up through the soil like some terrible spring, releasing waves of putrid air that spread across the square and into surrounding streets. The chemistry and biology of mass decomposition operating in these pits created conditions that went far beyond what happens when a single body decays. In a traditional grave, one body would decompose in soil, with the bacteria in the soil and the body itself breaking down the tissues in a process that, while certainly not pleasant-smelling, was at least limited in scope and contained underground. But in the mass graves of the plague era, you had hundreds of bodies in various stages of decomposition, all in proximity to each other, creating what was essentially a massive biological reactor. The heat, generated by bacterial action, combined with the summer sun beating down on the piles, created temperatures inside the burial pits that could reach surprisingly high levels, accelerating decay in ways that produced even more volatile compounds. The bodies weren't all fresh when they went in. Some had been dead for days before collection, especially from sealed houses or from the countryside where plague victims had lain undiscovered. This meant that decomposition was already well advanced in many bodies before they were even added to the pit, bringing their own established bacterial colonies and advanced decay products with them. The interaction between fresh bodies and older ones, between different bacterial populations, between the human decomposition and the decomposition of the limandat layers themselves, which contained their own organic material, created a complex ecosystem of decay that operated on a scale that was, in medieval European experience, entirely unprecedented. Workers tasked with grave duty represented a special category of plague-era labormen, desperate enough or drunk enough or brave enough to spend their days handling corpses and digging pits and trying to manage the unmanageable flow of bodies into the ground. These workers tied rags soaked in vinegar and herbs around their faces, creating makeshift masks that did almost nothing to filter the smell, but which provided psychological comfort and perhaps prevented some larger particles of contaminated material from being inhaled. The rags would need to be re-soaked frequently because the vinegar would evaporate and the smell would penetrate through, and the areas where they soaked their rags barrels of vinegar, stationed near the pits, became their own olfactory zones. The sharp acid smell of vinegar mixing with the sweet rot smell of death in combinations that were almost as disturbing as the death smell alone, perhaps because the vinegar smell represented the futile attempt to ward off what couldn't be warded off. Many of these workers drank themselves into a stupor before their shifts, consuming wine or stronger spirits in quantities that would have been considered problematic in any other context, but which, during the plague, seemed like the only reasonable response to the work they were doing. They drank partly for courage, partly so the alcohol fumes rising from their stomachs and being exhaled with their breath would add another layer of smell between their senses and the reek of the pits, and partly because being somewhat intoxicated made the horror more bearable, created a buffer between consciousness and full awareness of what they were worrying, and it created a buffer in a wereb effort of bewareford of going and king to a it, and a tweenus and sep but a populus and suan and silling and spenexane and smecken and excellence and within with win word with way with before and with slaka was with four sf with us with ox with I could put both the table but the ask I could up asa that what like but up got word but that was about swords it was These men were paid extraordinary wages by medieval standards, sometimes 10 or 20 times what an ordinary laborer might earn. But the money was meaningless in a plague economy where there was little to buy and where survival was more about luck than wealth. Most of these grave workers died within weeks anyway, not necessarily because handling the bodies directly infected them with plague, though that certainly happened, but because working so close to the massive rat populations that thrived around the burial pits exposed them to unprecedented numbers of infected fleas. The irony was terrible. Men, drawn to the work by high wages, became victims of those very wages, the money literally buying their deaths. Their bodies would often end up in the very pits they'd been digging, adding to the count, creating a cycle where grave workers dug pits, died, and were thrown into those pits by the next generation of grave workers, who would themselves soon follow. The smell of the grave workers themselves became distinctive. They couldn't fully clean themselves of the odor of their work, which clung to their clothes and skin and hair, marking them as plague workers in a way that made other citizens avoid them even more than they avoided each other during the general plague paranoia. These men moved through the city surrounded by an aura of death smell, and people would press themselves against walls or duck into doorways to avoid passing too close to them, as if the smell itself was contagious, which in the miasma theory of disease it essentially was. In summer, when the plague was often at its worst, because the warm weather favored the fleas that transmitted it, the heat made the smell problem exponentially worse, in ways that went beyond simply accelerating decomposition. The summer sun beat down on the open pits, raising surface temperatures to levels that essentially cooked the topmost layers of bodies and lime and dirt, creating a sun-baked crust that would crack and release trapped gases in sudden bursts. The smell became so intense that people several streets away, people who weren't even in the square and couldn't see the pits, would vomit when the wind shifted and carried the odor in their direction. Children, the elderly, pregnant women, people who were already weakened by malnutrition or other illnesses, all of these groups were particularly susceptible to the physical effects of the smell, which went beyond mere disgust to trigger actual physiological responses. The human body's disgust reaction to the smell of decomposition is deeply hardwired. It's a survival mechanism designed to keep us away from sources of disease and contamination. But during the plague, this useful instinct became a source of continuous torture because there was no getting away from the source, no safe distance to retreat to. No way to follow your body's urgent chemical messages telling you to flee from the dangerous odor, because that odor was everywhere, all the time. The city council, desperate to manage a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond any possibility of real control, tried various interventions to reduce the smell, or at least make it more bearable for the population that had to continue living in proximity to these mass graves. They ordered the burning of aromatic woods near the pit: cedar, pine, juniper, and any other resinous wood that would produce fragrant smoke when burned. Huge bonfires were constructed and kept burning around the clock, tended by workers who were themselves often plague victims who had recovered and thus were believed to be immune to reinfection, or by workers who were being paid premium wages and provided with food and drink to keep them at their posts. These bonfires created massive plumes of smoke that rose into the sky and could be seen from miles away, marking the location of the plague city like a beacon of disaster. The smell of burning cedar is normally pleasant, sweet, and clean with a slight astringency. Pine smoke has its own appeal, resinous and fresh. Juniper adds a gin-like aromatic note, but when these scents were produced in such enormous quantities, and when they were deliberately being used to mask the smell of rotting human flesh, they became associated with death in ways that made them disturbing rather than pleasant. The combination of wood smoke and decomposition created a unique smell that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives, a smell that would trigger traumatic memories whenever they encountered it again, even decades later when smelling a simple cedar fire in a peaceful context. The effectiveness of these aromatic fires was limited at best. They added another odor to the mix that was at least more pleasant than pure decomposition smell. And the smoke did create a kind of barrier that partially blocked some of the odor molecules. But the scale of the decomposition was simply too great for any amount of aromatic wood burning to truly mask or eliminate. What the fires actually accomplished was more psychological than practical. They showed that authorities were trying to do something, that the situation wasn't completely hopeless, that human agency still existed in some form even in the face of such overwhelming catastrophe. For the workers tending the fires, the constant smoke had its own problems. It irritated eyes and throats, made breathing difficult, covered everything in a layer of ash and soot, and created its own health issues. But these problems seemed minor compared to the alternative of facing the full unfiltered smell of the mass graves, and so the fires were maintained. Wood was continuously fed into them, and the smoke continued to rise, creating a permanent haze over the city center that mixed with the natural morning fog to create atmospheric conditions that reduced visibility and made the entire experience even more nightmarish and dreamlike, as if the city existed in some liminal space between the real world and the afterlife. The sound of the pits added to the horror in ways that reinforced the smell: the squelching of bodies being dropped into the pits, the thud of dirt being shoveled on top of them, the occasional muffled pop or hiss as decomposition gases escaped, and, most disturbing of all, the sounds of rats. The rat population around the burial pits grew to unprecedented numbers because here was an almost unlimited food source. The rats burrowed into the pits, nested in the spaces between bodies, fed on the flesh of the dead, and multiplied at rates that would have been alarming even in the best of circumstances. The smell of live rats, their musk, their urine, their droppings added yet another layer to the odor profile of the mass graves. And dead rats, because even rats didn't thrive indefinitely in such contaminated conditions, contributed their own small voices to the chorus of decomposition. The combination of human and rat decay, of the living rats that carried the fleas that spread the plague, and the dead rats that were themselves victims of the conditions they'd helped create, formed a cycle of death and smell that seemed to have no end point, no moment of resolution, but only continued intensifying as long as the plague continued to kill and the bodies continued to arrive for burial in numbers that exceeded anything the medieval systems of death management had been designed to handle. As you navigated the narrow medieval streets, trying to find routes to wherever you absolutely had to go because no one went out unless they had to. Every trip outside your home was a calculated risk that might be your last. Certain houses announced themselves long before you saw them, long before you could read the warning marks painted on their doors or notice their shuttered windows. Your nose told you everything you needed to know about what waited inside those buildings, and the information it provided was more detailed and terrible than any visual warning could convey. Doors marked with red crosses or painted symbols, sometimes accompanied by prayers or pleas for divine mercy scrawled by desperate family members, warned passers-by that plague dwelt within, that these houses had been touched by the pestilence and were to be avoided. But you didn't need the symbols your sense of smell had become, through terrible necessity, finally attuned to reading the olfactory signatures of different stages of plague and death, and you could tell from 20 or 30 paces away whether a house contained a recently dead, the longer dead, the dying, or had been abandoned entirely with corpses still inside. These abandoned homes became death traps of odor, sealed environments where the normal processes of decomposition proceeded in enclosed spaces with no ventilation, creating concentrations of smell that were almost unimaginable to anyone who hadn't experienced them directly. Bodies lay where they fell inside these houses, sometimes for weeks before anyone dared enter to remove them, or before the authorities got around to forcing entry and clearing out the dead. The summer heat, penetrating through medieval walls and roofs that provided poor insulation by modern standards, turned rooms into ovens where human remains cooked and rotted simultaneously, going through the stages of decomposition at accelerated rates. Medieval houses, especially those of ordinary citizens rather than the wealthy, were small and densely furnished with whatever possessions the family had accumulated: beds, tables, storage chests, clothes hanging from pegs, cooking utensils, tools of whatever trade the household pursued. All of these objects absorbed the smell of death, soaking it up like sponges, becoming permanent carriers of the odor long after the bodies themselves had been removed. Wooden furniture was particularly prone to this absorption. Wood is porous, full of tiny channels and spaces where volatile organic compounds from decomposition could penetrate and become trapped. The same qualities that made wood good for construction and furniture, its ability to absorb and release moisture, made it excellent at absorbing and retaining the smell of death. Fabrics were even worse: wool blankets, linen sheets, cloth garments. All of these materials became saturated with death smell. And because medieval people didn't have the facilities to properly wash and decontaminate these items, you'd need hot water, soap, and ideally some kind of sterilization, none of which were readily available in quantities sufficient for the task. They remained contaminated. Fluids from decomposing bodies and human decomposition produces a surprising and horrifying amount of liquid as tissues break down and cells rupture, seeped through floorboards, especially in multi-story buildings where bodies on upper floors would leak down to lower floors, creating waterfall effects of decomposition that spread contamination vertically through the structure. These fluids collected in whatever low points they could find, pooling in corners and depressions, soaking into the wooden floors, dripping down into cellars and storage areas, attracting rats in numbers that turned houses into rat colonies. The smell of these fluids was particularly terrible. It was the concentrated essence of human decomposition, the pure liquid form of decay, and it had a physical quality that made it seem almost alive, as if the smell itself was a presence in the house, rather than just a byproduct of what was happening there. The fluids created stains, dark, spreading marks on floors and walls that showed where bodies had lain, where liquids had flowed, mapping out in terrible detail the geography of death within the house. These stains remained even after the bodies were removed, permanent records of what had happened, and they continued to smell for months or even years, the wood having absorbed so much biological material that it became, in essence, a part of the structure. Some houses had been sealed by authorities as part of the effort to control the plague's spread, a practice that seemed reasonable in theory but was nightmarish in execution. When plague was discovered in a household, authorities in some cities would seal the entire house, nailing boards over the doors and windows, locking the inhabitants inside, whether they were sick or healthy, and posting guards to prevent anyone from leaving. This practice, called shutting up the house, was based on the theory that isolating plague victims would prevent the disease from spreading to others, which would have been sound public health policy if the disease had spread primarily through person-to-person contact rather than through flea bites. In reality, sealing households just trapped healthy people inside with sick ones, and with the massive rat and flea populations that were the actual disease vectors, essentially guaranteeing that everyone in the house would catch plague. The screams from within these sealed houses were one of the most traumatic aspects of the plague. For those who heard them, the cries of the healthy begging to be let out, the moans of the sick, the prayers and curses, and finally, the silence as everyone inside died. But the smell that emanated through every crack and crevice in these sealed structures told a story that was, if anything, even more terrible than the sounds had been. When a house was sealed with living people inside, those people went through all their dying in that enclosed space, and their bodies began decomposing there as well, because no one could enter to remove them. The smell built up over days and weeks, becoming more concentrated than in houses where at least the bodies had been removed relatively quickly. The sealed houses became like pressure cookers of odor, with decomposition gases having nowhere to go except through the tiny gaps in the medieval construction. The smell that escaped was almost physical in its intensity, thick enough that people claimed you could see it in the right light, a haze around the house that marked it as a place of death. The boards nailed over doors and windows didn't just prevent people from leaving, they prevented air circulation, creating anaerobic conditions in some parts of the house that altered the decomposition process, producing different volatile compounds than aerobic decomposition would create, adding new and even more disturbing notes to the smell profile. Some sealed houses developed a smell that witnesses described as sweet and terrible, a combination that suggested advanced at sweet, and a combination that suggested again as straight and putrefon. With opertome this often be spelfor and spelver smelft kimsens, but mensing spraced beskames becames bekexen gen pour them spare where before if for so it where or if for where have for if whip the who's put up with the how pack off the hot love where go ask ho alexek go how beside papa well cow the first with bogarts scroll said okay for scott which but roofs cooks been for sister the red woods but this before this opportunistic looters who dared enter these houses, and there were always some people desperate or greedy enough to take the risk, hoping to find valuables that they could steal from the dead who had no more need for earthly possessions, emerged from their brief forays gagging and retching, their clothes so saturated with the stench that they'd often burn them later rather than try to clean them. The looters described the experience of entering a plague house in terms that were almost hallucinatory. The smell was so overwhelming that it affected their other senses, creating the sensation that they were moving through something thick and resistant, rather than just air, that the smell had texture and weight. They talked about the smell clinging to you, following them even after they left the house, lingering in their nostrils for days or weeks, haunting them even when they were far from the source. This wasn't just psychological. The volatile organic compounds from decomposition can indeed adhere to skin and clothing and hair. And because the human sense of smell is so sensitive to these particular compounds, we're evolutionarily programmed to detect the smell of death at very low concentrations as a survival mechanism. Even tiny amounts of residual material could produce the sensation of being continuously exposed to the smell. The looters who survived their raids on plague houses, and many of them didn't survive, succumbing to plague themselves within days or weeks, reported that different rooms in a house had different smell profiles, creating a kind of olfactory map of how the plague had moved through the household. The bedroom where the first victim had died and decomposed had the most intense smell, a bass note that pervaded the entire structure. The kitchen, where family members might have tried to continue preparing food even as the plague ravaged them, had its own characteristic smell, food gone bad mixed with death, a combination that was particularly disturbing because food smells are normally positive and appetite stimulating. But here they became corrupted and mixed with their opposite. The cellar or storage areas, where bodies or body fluids might have drained down from upper floors, had a dank, concentrated smell that was somehow worse than the more open areas because it was trapped and festering in enclosed spaces. Children's rooms, which inevitably contained the bodies of children because children died in huge numbers during the plague, having less developed immune systems and being more vulnerable to the disease, had a smell that witnesses found particularly unbearable, not because it was chemically different from the smell of adult decomposition, but because of what it represented, the death of beltal decomposition. But because of what it represented, with it death as a death of deficence, at death of enus, at death of deficence within us, def get of guinness for siplef sat out of xervim with or pruta or witsmen as a quir. This witter with that's look at who have cup put with my hat at sepa what about what up with heart cup with get to back gas was put up air Os the failure of parents to protect their children, the extinction of entire futures that would never be realized, The seasonal variation in abandoned house smells was significant and added another layer of horror to the experience. In winter, cold temperatures slowed decomposition, which sounds like it might be better, but actually created its own problems. Bodies that died in winter might lie frozen or partially frozen for weeks before spring thaw, at which point they'd all begin decomposing simultaneously, creating a massive pulse of smell that marked the change of seasons as reliably as any calendar. The smell of spring during the plague years wasn't the smell of flowers blooming and earth awakening, it was the smell of winter's accumulated dead beginning to decompose all at once. In summer, as already discussed, heat accelerated everything, turning houses into hotboxes where decomposition proceeded at maximum speed. In autumn, the cooling temperatures created strange effects where decomposition would slow down but not stop, creating bodies in intermediate states of decay that produced their own unique smell profiles. The medieval calendar, which was organized around agricultural cycles and religious festivals, took on new meanings during the plague years. The seasons were marked not by harvests and holy days, but by different manifestations of death and different qualities of the smell that announced it. The impact on neighborhood social structures was profound and lasting. When a house became an abandoned plague house, it affected not just that one building, but the entire immediate area. Neighbors couldn't escape the smell. It was there whenever they opened their windows, whenever they went outside, whenever they tried to cook food or sleep or do any of the ordinary activities of life. Property values, to the extent that such a concept existed in the medieval economy, collapsed for any building adjacent to a known plague house. People abandoned their own homes not because they themselves had plague, but because they couldn't bear to live next to houses that smelled of death, creating cascading abandonment where one plague house would lead to others being abandoned, leading to entire neighborhoods becoming ghost districts within the larger city. The smell was a social force as powerful as the disease itself, driving behavior, breaking communities, reshaping the physical geography of cities in ways that would last beyond the plague years themselves. Streets where the smell had been particularly bad became permanently associated with death, acquiring reputations that persisted for generations, with people avoiding them or renting property there only at steep discounts because the memory of the plague smell lingered even after the actual smell had faded. The eventual clearing out of these abandoned houses, which had to happen at some point if the city was to recover any functionality, was a task that fell to specialized crews who were, in many cases, essentially convicts or the absolutely desperate being forced or paid to do work that no one else would touch. These crews would break open the sealed houses, flooding them with air for the first time in weeks or months, releasing trapped odors in one massive exhalation that would temporarily make the entire street uninhabitable. They'd remove the bodies, or what remained of them after weeks of decomposition and rat feeding, and attempt to clean the houses enough to make them usable again. But the smell never fully left these buildings. Even after the visible remains were removed, even after the floors were scrubbed and the walls were whitewashed and new occupants moved in, people reported that the houses retained a smell, faint but detectable, particularly in certain weather conditions or at certain times of day, as if the walls themselves had memory and were whispering their terrible secrets to anyone sensitive enough to hear or, in this case, smell them. Plague houses became part of urban folklore, buildings with reputations, adroting with repute fokils, villeting of musical building, evasics and agresses, equalties of rerakities, visical recical kisical babisical, visical cobisical gauls, bisical cat gibbles, bisicogs, pickle its equasis at it was 6 wickets ixic, wicked whippet whippetape, wicked dip with ass and whiskapita with this set for at but if there's a how that wixic could whip up a hooked up at a pap with a stuff crack whip spa ho ha gop lucas gapat stuff who have bawgas with this sopat course the market still operated in some diminished form, because even during apocalypse people need to eat and commerce can't completely stop without causing instant societal collapse. But it was a shadow of its former self, a ghost of the vibrant commercial center it had been before the plague arrived and transformed everything. The smell here was a bizarre and deeply unsettling mixture of normal commerce attempting to continue, following patterns that had governed trade for centuries, and the plague's omnipresent influence that corrupted and tainted even the most ordinary transactions. Where before the market had been a riot of smells: fresh bread, roasted meat, exotic spices, leather goods, flowers, herbs, all the scents of medieval commercial life competing for attention. Now everything was overlaid with the smell of death and desperation that made even the most appealing food smells seem suspicious and potentially dangerous, as if the very act of eating had become fraught with risk in ways it had never been before. Fishmongers still sold their catch, still laid out on rough wooden tables whatever they'd managed to pull from the river or had acquired from fishermen brave enough or desperate enough to continue their trade. But fish rotted faster now in the summer heat because there were fewer buyers, and the buyers who did come wanted to linger as little as possible, completing their transactions with desperate speed and then fleeing the marketplace before they'd have to breathe the air there any longer than absolutely necessary. The smell of fish is distinctive even when fresh, that marine, slightly fishy odor that speaks of salt water and ocean depths even in freshwater species. But fish that's gone bad produces one of the most offensive smells in the natural world, a combination of trimethylamine and other breakdown products that hits the nose with almost violent intensity. During the plague, with fish sitting unsold for hours or days, this spoiled fish smell became a dominant note in the marketplace odorscape. The fishmongers couldn't afford to throw away unsold fish because supplies were unreliable, and they needed to sell whatever they had to make enough money to survive. So they'd tried to sell day-old fish, two-day-old fish, fish that was on the edge of being dangerous to consume. The customers knew this, but often had no choice. You bought what was available or you went hungry, because the normal abundance of the market had evaporated as supply chains broke down and producers died or fled. The smell of spoiled fish mixed with that of overripe fruits and vegetables that sat unsold for days, creating combinations that were individually unpleasant but which together produced something almost surreal in its intensity. Rotting vegetables each have their characteristic smell. Cabbage going bad produces sulfurous compounds that smell like sweat and decay. Onions rotting create an almost sweet but disturbing smell. Apples fermenting produce alcohol and vinegar-like odors. Melons split open and rotting have a sickly sweet smell that seems pleasant for a fraction of a second before the rot component registers and creates revulsion. In normal times, produce that started to go bad would be thrown out or fed to pigs. But during the plague, waste of any kind seemed foolish when people were hungry, so merchants tried to sell damaged or aging produce at reduced prices, and customers tried to pick through the good and bad. And the overall effect was a marketplace that smelled like a compost heap, mixed with a fish market, mixed with a charnel house, all of it baking in the summer sun. Butchers still hung meat on hooks in front of their stalls, trying to maintain the appearance of normal commerce. But sanitation had completely broken down in ways that went beyond the already marginal sanitation standards of medieval markets. In normal times, butchers would slaughter animals in designated areas, process the meat according to guild regulations and local laws, clean their work areas with at least basic regularity, and manage waste in ways that, while primitive by modern standards, at least showed some understanding of cleanliness. But during the plague, these standards evaporated. Butchers were dying like everyone else. Apprentices weren't being trained because masters weren't taking on new apprentices when the future was so uncertain. Inspections weren't happening because the officials who would normally conduct them were dead or had fled. The meat hanging on display often came from animals of questionable health. The best livestock wasn't coming to market anymore because the best breeders and farmers were disrupted by plague. The smell of raw meat, which has its own characteristic iron blood odor even when fresh, became mixed with the smell of meat going bad. The bacterial action creating surface slime and gas production that gave the meat a greenish cast and a smell that was sweetly putrid. Flies, which are always attracted to meat but which had become absolutely plague-like themselves in numbers during the plague years, benefiting from all the available food sources, swarmed everything in black clouds that were so thick they seemed almost solid. The sound of flies, that constant buzzing drone, became the soundtrack of the marketplace, and their presence added its own olfactory. Component flies themselves have a smell, and in such massive numbers, that smell became noticeable, a kind of musty insect odor that mixed with everything else. Blood ran in the gutters of the market square, mixing with everything else that accumulated in medieval street gutters, the normal waste, the rain water, the plague-related contamination, creating a soup that was simultaneously a public health disaster and a feeding ground for rats. The smell of blood is distinctive, that metallic iron-rich odor that's simultaneously familiar and disturbing. That triggers something primal in the human brain, because we're programmed to recognize it as a sign of injury and danger. Fresh blood smells different from old blood, which oxidizes and takes on notes of iron and copper and a kind of sweetness that's distinctly unpleasant. During the plague, the marketplace gutters ran with both fresh blood from daily butchering, mixing with old blood from previous days that hadn't drained away properly, all of it attracting flies and rats and creating a visible and olfactory reminder that the normal cycles of cleaning and maintenance that kept medieval cities marginally functional had broken down. The butchers themselves, who in normal times would have at least made some effort to clean blood from their persons and aprons, now worked covered in blood and viscera, adding their own contribution to the marketplace smellscape. Spice merchants, interestingly, did brisk business during the plague, selling aromatic compounds to those who could afford them, because the market for anything that might mask or counteract the smell of death was essentially unlimited for anyone with money to spare. These merchants sold cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, pepper, and more exotic spices like saffron and cardamom, substances that had always been valuable, but which now took on almost magical significance as potential protectors against plague. The smell of a spice merchant's stall was intense and complex, a mixture of dozens of different aromatic compounds, all competing for attention, creating an olfactory experience that was almost overwhelming in its intensity, but which was at least pleasant, overwhelming rather than horrible overwhelming. Wealthy citizens would stop at these stalls and spend what would have been, in normal times, shocking amounts of money on spices they'd carry with them, stuff into pomanders, burn in their homes, add to their food in quantities far beyond what any recipe would call for. The spice merchants marked up their prices dramatically. This was basic supply and demand, and the demand for anything that smelled good was effectively infinite, and many of them made fortunes during the plague years. Though what good that fortune did them when they might die tomorrow is an open question. Wealthy citizens would hold pomanders to their noses constantly, while in the marketplace, small perforated balls, often made of silver or gold, and intricately decorated, filled with a mixture of musk, ambergris, and spices, all of which were expensive and exotic materials that had to be imported from great distances at considerable cost. These pomanders were both functional and status symbols. They showed that you could afford to protect yourself in ways that the poor could not, that you still had access to luxury goods even during the plague, that you were maintaining standards of civilization even as the world fell apart. The smell that emanated from a pomander was complex and rich. The musk provided an animal-based note that was both slightly disturbing and strangely attractive. The ambergris added a marine, almost oceanic quality that was both earthy and refined, and the spices contributed their various sharp and sweet and warm notes. Holding one of these to your nose created a bubble of alternative smell, a personal atmosphere that excluded the marketplace odors at least temporarily, allowing wealthy plague refugees to move through the commercial district without having to fully confront the olfactory reality of that. Cannot by with plepigrout, clever of finis with the clef for it, cat with clep with plea of clay, but it with clef to souls at part with plus or with thou aslick weblik after with pat papata a cat attack up as a half off at mouth house stuff blisk. But that bag got difficult I've got the ask af muskov lust das words mit not that's bist the desperate poor, who couldn't afford pomanders or expensive spices, made do with cheaper solutions that were less effective, but showed the same desperate impulse to create some kind of olfactory defense against the plague. Garlic, which they believed warded off plague, and which had the advantage of being relatively cheap and locally available, was worn in bags around the neck, rubbed on the body, eaten in quantities that would have seemed excessive in any other context. The smell of garlic in massive concentrations is distinctive and penetrating, that sulfurous, sharp odor that clings to the breath and skin and becomes all-consuming when you're exposed to enough of it. During the plague, many of the poor smelled constantly of garlic, creating their own aromatic cloud that was probably less pleasant than what the wealthy could afford, but which served the same psychological purpose of creating separation between themselves and the ambient smell of death. Onions were used similarly, creating a different but equally penetrating smell. Some people made do with simple rags soaked in vinegar or cheap wine, holding these to their noses when the smell became particularly overwhelming, creating localized zones of sharp acid smell that cut through other odors, at least temporarily. The smell of panic had its own character in the marketplace, something that's difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it, but which was very irreal to those who were there. Fear produces physiological changes, increased sweating, changes in the composition of that sweat that makes it smell more acrid and sharp, stress hormones that alter body odor, rapid breathing that creates its own smell effects. When hundreds of people are all in a state of sustained terror, all experiencing these physiological changes simultaneously, the collective effect is a smell that's distinct from any individual component. This is the smell of fear sweat, that sharp, slightly ammonia-like odor that's different from exercise sweat or heat sweat. It's the sour smell of empty stomachs, because many people weren't eating properly either, because they'd lost their appetite from fear and nausea, or because food was genuinely scarce and they were rationing what they had. It's the smell of unwashed bodies. People weren't bathing regularly because bathing required effort and resources, and because the advice about whether bathing during plague was safe varied wildly, with some authorities claiming that bathing opened the pores and made you more susceptible to plague, while others claimed the opposite. Underneath all these specific smells was the knowledge, shared by everyone in the marketplace, that any of these people could be dead tomorrow, that they themselves could be dead tomorrow, that the market might not exist next week, that civilization as they knew it might be ending. This knowledge, this awareness, seemed to have its own smell, or at least the collective anxiety produced olfactory effects that became associated with the marketplace during plague times. The marketplace also became a zone of black humor and desperate commerce in plague-related goods that would have seemed macabre in any other context. Vendors sold fake plague cures, protective amulets, prayer cards, relics, real or forged, medicines that claimed to ward off or cure plague, and 1,000 other products designed to capitalize on fear. Some of these products had their own distinctive smells. The medicines might contain mercury, which has a very distinctive metallic odor when its compounds are heated or agitated, sulfur, the classic rotten egg smell, or various herbs and extracts. The smell of sulfur, in particular, became strongly associated with plague cures because it was used in various remedies and fumigation processes, despite having no actual efficacy against plague. The vendors hawking these products created their own microenvironments of smell, little islands of specific odors within the larger marketplace smellscape, and desperate buyers would move from vendor to vendor, sampling different products, trying to find something, anything, that might give them an edge in the fight for survival. The temporal aspect of marketplace smells created its own rhythm and pattern. Early morning, when the market first opened, was relatively better. The cool night air had dispersed some odors. Produce that had arrived overnight was still relatively fresh, and there was a brief window where commerce could almost seem normal. As the day progressed and the sun rose higher, warming everything, the smells intensified in predictable ways. By midday, the marketplace was at its worst, with all the various odors reaching peak intensity simultaneously. By late afternoon, as sellers began packing up what little they'd sold and disposing of what they couldn't sell, a different set of smells would emerge: the smell of waste being swept into gutters, of unsold food being thrown out or loaded onto carts to be dumped somewhere outside the city walls, of the day's accumulation of blood and spoilage being hosed down with water or simply left to dry overnight. Evening brought some relief as temperatures dropped and the marketplace emptied, but the smells that had been created during the day lingered, absorbed into the wooden stalls and stone pavement, ready to be resolved into the wooden stalls. Ready to go it, ready to do it. Palby would be ready to Betty to be Pepperby. The belly illers, kabik, panic, and panic, wake, and with me bad, beside the bread, peppers, was a house at house with the cat, with bad cup up, dab, back, walk, out, what, Alex, you said us 6 more, no guys, slat, with the best, love, was poised with the This daily rhythm of smell, intensifying and somewhat abating, became one of the temporal markers of plague life, as reliable as sunrise and sunset, a olfactory clock that told you what time of day it was, even if you couldn't see the sun. A new smell announced itself with the sound of chanting and the crack of whips on flesh long before you could see the source. A smell that was both familiar in its components and utterly alien in its combination and intensity. The flagellants had come to town, and their arrival brought with it an olfactory assault that somehow managed to be both more controlled and more disturbing than the chaotic smell of the plague itself. These religious extremists, who believed the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins and that public self-torture would bring salvation both individual and collective, moved through the streets in processions that were part religious ceremony, part public spectacle, and part traveling horror show. They whipped themselves until they bled, using specially designed scourges with multiple leather thongs often tipped with metal points or shards of glass, creating wounds that went far beyond superficial cuts into deep lacerations that exposed muscle and sometimes even bone. The smell of fresh blood was metallic and sharp, that distinctive iron-rich odor that cuts through even the plague stench for a moment, creating a brief olfactory interruption that your nose registered with something almost like relief before the full horror of what you were smelling registered in your consciousness. Fresh blood has a clean quality to it, if such a word can be applied to the smell of violence and suffering. It's the smell of living tissue exposed to air, of iron and proteins, and the chemical components of life itself suddenly made external and visible. But the flagellants didn't just create the smell of fresh blood for a moment. Before moving on, they traveled from town to town, spending weeks or months on the road, never bathing because they believed suffering brought them closer to God, and because they embraced physical degradation as a form of spiritual purification. Their bodies were unwashed for weeks, covered in layers of sweat and dirt and the dust of the roads they traveled. Their clothes stiff with dried blood from previous flagellation sessions and pus from infected wounds. The smell of unwashed human bodies is something medieval people were accustomed to. Bathing was infrequent for everyone, and body odor was just part of the normal human smellscape. But the flagellants took this to extremes that even medieval noses found shocking. They smelled of weeks or months of accumulated sweat, that sour sharp odor that develops when sweat bacteria break down the compounds in human perspiration and create new volatile molecules that announce themselves forcefully. They smelled of the roads they'd traveled, carrying with them the dust and mud and animal waste of a dozen different cities and towns, a geographic history written in smell. They smelled of their own fervor and religious ecstasy, that particular sharp stress sweat that fear and intense emotion produce, different from the sweat of physical exertion or simple heat. And underneath all of this was the smell of blood, not just fresh blood from today's flagellation, but old blood, dried blood, blood that had soaked into their clothes and been re-wetted by new blood day after day, creating layers of biological material that had its own complex chemistry. Infections set in quickly and inevitably when you're creating open wounds in conditions of medieval hygiene and then traveling through plague-ridden cities, exposing those wounds to every kind of environmental contamination imaginable. The smell of gangrena, sickly sweet rot, mixed with something indescribably foul that combines the worst elements of decomposition with the particular horror of living flesh dying while still attached to a living body, surrounded the flagellants like an aura. Gangrene produces its own distinctive set of odors because it's caused by bacteria that thrive in oxygen-poor environments, creating different metabolic byproducts than the bacteria involved in normal decomposition. There's a sweet note that's almost pleasant in isolation, but which in this context becomes profoundly disturbing. A smell that tricks your nose for a fraction of a second before your brain processes what you're actually smelling and recoils in horror. Mixed with this sweetness is a fecal component, because some of the bacteria involved in gangrene are related to intestinal bacteria and produce similar compounds, creating a smell that triggers visceral disgust responses. And there's a rot component that's different from the rot smell of fully dead tissue. This is the smell of dying tissue, of cells in the process of death, of the boundary zone between life and death manifesting as odor. Many of the flagellants carried the plague without knowing it, because the incubation period for plague meant you could be infected and infectious for several days before symptoms appeared. And because the flagellants were so focused on their religious mission and so accustomed to suffering that they might not recognize plague symptoms until the disease was well advanced, they spread it to every town they visited, creating new outbreaks or intensifying existing ones, all while believing they were bringing salvation when in reality they were bringing death. The crowds had gathered to watch their performances because that's what they were, carefully choreographed public displays of suffering designed to inspire religious fervor and perhaps guilt in the observers stood close together, breathing in the same air as the infected flagellants, providing perfect conditions for the fleas that carried plague to jump from one warm body to another. The irony was terrible, and complete people came to watch the flagellants, hoping to gain spiritual protection from the plague, and instead contracted the disease from the very people they believed would save them. The smell of the crowds mixed with the smell of the flagellants, creating olfactory zones where you could track the progression of the procession through the city by the smell here they'd just passed, the smell of blood and infected flesh still hanging in the air. There they were currently performing, the smell intensified by their exertions and the crowd's presence. And there ahead of them the streets still smelled only of normal plague horror, waiting to receive this additional layer of olfactory assault. The flagellants burned incense during their processions, creating clouds of scented smoke that mingled with the smell of blood and infected flesh in combinations that witnesses described as hell's perfume. The incense they used was the same frankincense and myrrh and other aromatics that churches used, that plague doctors used, that anyone trying to ward off plague or purifying contaminated air used. But in the context of the flagellant procession, these familiar religious smells took on new and disturbing connotations. The smoke was thick and white, or slightly yellow depending on what exactly was being burned, and it rose in columns and clouds that partially obscured the flagellants from view, creating a kind of theatrical effect where you'd see glimpses of bloodied bodies through the smoke, hear the crack of whips and the chanting of prayers, smell the incense mixed with blood and infection. The combination was deliberately designed to be overwhelming to all the senses. This was religious theater operating at maximum intensity, trying to shock and awe observers into religious transformation, into recognition of their sins and desperation into recognition of their sitchins, into recognitions in his speckenish of nesinitions in its denisoners, into repentance in mechanisonance in with your mensenek in your hand, and basic ninsad with the beperd, with canum, with the sour or fit glod and with qued, but perhaps was at up but with the habit web cat with la were hapa cat was cat by out of smooth out of gay cast but I will ask with cat scoop with a wizard at first for the smell was part of that calculated effect, though it went beyond what the flagellants consciously intended, because they couldn't control the smell of their infections, or the way the smoke would combine with the smell of crowded unwashed bodies, or how the whole olfactory complex would interact with the background smell of plague that was everywhere in the city anyway. The psychological impact of the flagellant smell was complex and reveals much about how smell operates in human consciousness and culture. On one level, the smell was repulsive blood infection, unwashed bodies. All of this should have driven people away, should have triggered the same disgust and avoidance response that the plague smell triggered. But it didn't, at least not in the same way, because the flagellant smell was interpreted through a religious framework that gave it meaning and even a kind of twisted sacred quality. This was the smell of suffering for Christ, of penance, of people who were willing to destroy their own bodies in the hope of saving their souls, and perhaps the souls of others. In medieval Christianity, suffering had positive value. Christ had suffered on the cross, martyrs had suffered for their faith, ascetics suffered as a path to holiness. The flagellants were taking this theology to an extreme, but it was an extreme that existed on a continuum with accepted religious practice, not something completely alien to medieval religious sensibility. So the smell, horrible as it was, carried connotations of holiness, of sacrifice, of spiritual power that made it simultaneously repulsive and attractive, disgusting and fascinating. People who would avoid the smell of a plague victim would crowd close to smell the flagellants, would try to touch their bloodied garments, would collect drops of their blood as relics, all behaviors that make no sense from a purely hygienic perspective, but which make perfect sense in a religious framework where suffering and blood have sacred meaning. The flagellants themselves, from the inside of their experience, related to smell in ways that were different from everyone else in the plague city. They weren't trying to avoid or mask the smells of blood and infection. They were embracing them as signs of their devotion and the authenticity of their suffering. The smell of their own blood and infected wounds was proof that they were truly suffering, not just performing or pretending. And in their theological framework, authentic suffering had spiritual efficacy. They would have noticed the reactions of the crowds to their smell, the disgust, the fascination, the fear, The religious ornd interpreted these reactions as confirmation that they were doing something powerful and meaningful, that their extreme practices were having the effect they intended. The smell marked them as different, as special, as people who had gone beyond normal human limits in pursuit of divine favor. In a world where the plague was killing indiscriminately, where all normal social hierarchies and markers of status seemed meaningless in the face of universal death, the flagellants created a new hierarchy based on who could endure the most suffering, and smell was one of the markers of position. In that hierarchy, the worse you smelled, the more infected your wounds, the more completely you'd embraced the flagellant path and its promise of salvation through suffering. The routes the flagellants traveled became marked, not just by memory, but by smell, because they would stop in each town or city for several days, performing their rituals multiple times per day, and the places where they performed would absorb the smell of blood and infection and incense, creating olfactory landmarks that persisted after they'd moved on. Town squares where flagellants had performed would smell different for days or weeks afterward. The stones stained with blood that had soaked into porous surfaces, the air still carrying traces of the incense they'd burned. The whole area marked as a place where something intense and disturbing had happened. Children would be warned away from these places, or conversely would be drawn to them in the way children are often drawn to things that are forbidden or disturbing, and would sniff around trying to detect the lingering traces of the flagellant smell, both repulsed and fascinated. The olfactory geography of the city would be temporarily reorganized around the path the flagellants had taken, creating a map of their passage that you could follow with your nose, connecting the places where they'd performed and the houses where they'd stayed, if anyone was brave or pious enough to offer them shelter, and the churches where they'd stayed, if anyone was brave, and the shelter and the churches where they bowed, where they bayed, where they will be weighed, prive with they whether we braid it, they will bay it, whether we will, where we will, if we be well, we with it, we who with who formed, we plowed with spore it with off, with harless wessick, what are we've been set to with pap tap up, with old and who half, walk, what fit are that wall, take order, walk out, where it's goes, that's the cloud, that's what's The relationship between the flagellants and the plague doctors was particularly interesting from an olfactory perspective, because both groups created elaborate smell-based systems but for completely different purposes, based on completely different understandings of how the world worked. The plague doctors tried to create pleasant, or at least strong smells, to ward off plague miasma, operating on a medical theory that was wrong but which at least attempted to be rational and empirical. The flagellants created terrible smells as a byproduct of their suffering, operating on a theological theory that suffering pleased God and could avert divine punishment, which was also wrong but in a different way. When plague doctors encountered flagellant processions, which they sometimes did, the result was a bizarre olfactory clash, the carefully constructed aromatics of the plague doctor's beak and robes meeting the blood infection smell of the flagellants, both smells claiming in their different ways to offer protection against plague, both actually offering no real protection at all. Some plague doctors condemned the flagellants as superstitious madmen who were spreading plague rather than preventing it, which was actually correct, though not for the reasons the doctor not, that was the reasons the doctor is, though not clagin that, though not the lane with plagians, when actually in it, an excellence and wickjerk, and not when again with an ikin, act with and when was slam, was a bed out where a house would to pop make a bat hap whack Some flagellants condemned the plague doctors as practitioners of useless worldly medicine, when what was needed was spiritual transformation, which was also sort of correct in that the doctor's remedies didn't work, though the flagellants' remedies didn't work either, and made things worse by facilitating disease transmission. The eventual suppression of the flagellant movement by church authorities, who became alarmed at the movement's independence from church control and its potential for social disruption, came too late to prevent them from contributing significantly to plague spread across Europe. But even after official suppression, the memory of the flagellants remained, and the smell they'd created, that distinctive combination of blood, infection, incense, and unwashed fervor, became part of the cultural memory of the plague years. Survivors would talk about the flagellants in terms that were simultaneously horrified and awed, describing the smell as part of the overall nightmare of the plague era, a smell that seemed to crystallize everything terrible about those years into one overwhelming olfactory experience. The smell became, in memory, almost emblematic of the religious desperation and the extreme responses that plague provoked. The way people would try anything, no matter how extreme or irrational, if there was even the slightest hope it might offer protection or salvation. Decades after the plague had passed, old people would describe the flagellant smell to their grandchildren, trying to convey what it had been like when the world seemed to be ending, and people responded by destroying their own bodies in public displays that combined religious-like madness and the smell blood and rot and incense and the smell blood and rot and incense became a shorthand for describing the psychological as well as physical horror of living through the Black Death. Those few physicians who remained in the plague-stricken cities, who hadn't fled to country estates or died themselves from the disease they were trying to treat, attempted every remedy they knew, and many they invented in desperate hope, drawing on classical medical texts, folk traditions, alchemical theories, and pure guesswork in their efforts to combat a disease they didn't understand and had no effective tools to fight. Their treatments added their own bouquet of smells to the plague-ridden air, creating olfactory environments in their homes and treatment rooms that were distinct from the general plague smell but no less disturbing. In some ways even more disturbing, because these were smells of supposed healing that often led only to additional suffering and death. The smell of medical intervention during the plague years was the smell of failure dressed up in the language and material of learning and expertise, of classical authorities, of classical or classical authority, of disical of clarity, of classical arsecund, classical evicils, the classical cucle of descades, beskabord, tapri, tapspesper, in its plespekenmersper posbergs, bixap proxats, with it proxica plux kip burp with a wickenman work, we said it, with pick clicked, wibble how with bat, water, stop with at boat bat, with up as good, but us go past before we have what cook come up big. Those the most bust mass didn't twist the way with his small cyst. Let's go left and let's do first. Flash with the bloodletting was one of the most common medical interventions of the medieval period for almost any ailment. Based on the theory of humoral medicine, which held that disease was caused by imbalances in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and that draining excess blood could restore balance. The smell of blood, both fresh and dried, permeated physicians' homes and workshops, where they saw patients and performed their treatments. Fresh blood has that metallic, iron-rich smell that's both distinctive and somewhat disturbing, a smell that triggers something primal in human consciousness, because we're programmed to recognize it as a sign of injury and potential danger. But blood, in the quantities that physicians were dealing with, they would drain multiple patients per day, extracting pints of blood from each, believing that this would purge the plague from their systems, created a smell environment that went beyond what you'd encounter from a single injury. Basins of blood sat around their workrooms, waiting to be disposed of, and medieval physicians would examine the blood they'd drained, looking for signs in its color and consistency and smell that would tell them about the patient's condition and whether the treatment was working. The smell of blood changes as it sits exposed to air. Iron compounds oxidize, creating different olfactory molecules, and bacterial action begins relatively quickly, adding notes of decay even to blood that's only hours old. Old blood from yesterday's patients that hadn't been cleaned up properly, had a smell that was both metallic and slightly sweet, with undertones of rot that announced the presence of decomposition even in this substance that had so recently been part of living bodies. The smell was copper-like. That particular metallic odor, that copper and iron share, and that blood has because of its iron content in the hemoglobin that carries oxygen through the body. It was also slightly sweet in a way that wasn't pleasant, a sweetness that had nothing to do with sugar and everything to do with the complex organic molecules in blood, breaking down and releasing volatile compounds that happen to trigger the same olfactory receptors that respond to some sweet smells. Mixed with this was the smell of the patients themselves, the fever sweat that plague victims produced in enormous quantities. Sweat that had its own distinctive smell, because the metabolic changes caused by plague altered its chemical composition. The patient's fear added its own notes to their sweat smell, that sharp stress odor that terror produces. And underneath all of this was often the smell of the buboes themselves. those characteristic plague swellings in lymph nodes that could grow to the size of eggs or even larger, that often ruptured and leaked pus and blood, creating wounds that had all the olfactory characteristics of infected tissue: the sweet rot, smell of bacterial action, the metallic smell of blood, the particular foul odor that pus produces, which is essentially dead white blood cells and bacteria and tissue debris, all mixed together in a liquid that might be white or yellow or greenish depending on the infection. Physicians applied poultices and plasters to the buboes, using recipes that ranged from the classical based on ancient Greek and Roman medical texts to the folk traditional, to the completely made up in desperate experimentation. These mixtures included substances that sound bizarre to modern ears, but which made sense within medieval medical theory, and which created their own distinctive smells when applied to infected, weeping sores. For wealthy patients, some physicians would use crushed emeralds or other precious stones, operating on the theory that gems had inherent properties that could draw out disease. The smell here would have been minimal from the gems themselves, but the binding agents used to hold the crushed stone in place, oils, waxes, plant materials, would have added their own notes. For ordinary patients, the materials were more mundane, but often more bedicians, was bedicily got boden molden pudilis, begessedly becubili spogulis, but because of becubizings, bobscobishly subus skisses to babs babbitt. Gops babs, copazixcus sopais bobs, babis pepen bod babas or babuxek bak wabab, Barnsberg, homework, go bob, so much work, we bow with bar, we go well, with whipper, bow, quick up, wick off, whip up, back, up over, with whipper surface, with whatever us all, got down, foul bass, cast go was cut. With our carcass, we up to wood about to cut up a sting with this covered so cut on the smell of animal dung is familiar to anyone who's been around farms or animals. That earthy, fecal odor that's organic and natural, but certainly not pleasant, especially in quantities, and especially when deliberately applied to human bodies. Ground beetles, which were used in various medieval remedies, added their own smell when crushed, an insect smell that was sharp and slightly acrid. The smell of chitin and insect body fluids, and whatever the beetles had been eating before they were caught and killed and ground up for medicine. Herbs were central to medieval medicine, and the smell of crushed and mixed medicinal herbs was a constant presence in physicians' workrooms. Wormwood, with its intensely bitter smell that's almost aggressive in the way it announces itself to the nose, was used in various preparations. Rue, another strongly scented herb with a smell that's been described as both medicinal and slightly unpleasant, was believed to have protective properties. Tansy, mugwort, yarrow, hyssop, horehoundel, of these and dozens more were part of the medieval pharmacopoeia, each with its distinctive smell, and physicians would combine them in different mixtures trying to find something that worked. The smell of an apothecary or physician's workshop was layers upon layers of these herbal scents, some pleasant individually, but overwhelming in combination, mixed with the smells of the other ingredients, animal materials, minerals, imported substances, and the smells of disease and suffering from the patients being treated. When these herbal mixtures were applied to buboes, the smell of the herbs would mix with the smell of the infected tissue, creating combinations that were both aromatic and putrid simultaneously, smellously lonas smellously, mellust of missning, nithily menismith missens, methamena crescentmo, mailers mepisancre, binin with mice, semels, so suswixoidal its eckets, and it works at plissan so is so, and wizard cow will good wis at wiz or with size sexy, no up with a whipper ha ba bus up gas math, ask what hell I po ask us to go up as I took up my stock well cows because the particular is last to if wasn't burning herbs was constant in sick rooms, based on the miasma theory that bad air caused disease and good air created by burning aromatic substances could cure or prevent it. Rosemary, sage, bay leaves, and wormwood were burned in sick rooms until the smoke was thick enough to make eyes water and breathing difficult. The smell of burning rosemary is normally quite pleasant, piney and fresh with slight camphor notes, but in the quantities used during plague treatment, it became overwhelming and almost oppressive. Sage smoke has an earthy, slightly musty quality that's agreeable in moderation, but suffocating in excess. Bay leaves burning create a smell that's herbal and slightly medicinal, with hints of eucalyptus and mint. Wormwood smoke is intensely bitter and has a quality that seems to penetrate not just your nose but your whole head, a smell that's almost aggressive in its intensity. Combined and concentrated in closed or poorly ventilated sick rooms, these smells created an atmosphere that was thick and heavy, where breathing felt like work, where the smoke irritated throats and lungs already stressed by disease or by caring for the diseased. The theory was that good air created by the aromatic smoke would drive out bad air that caused plague, but in reality the smoke just made it harder to breathe while doing nothing to stop the fleas that actually carried the disease. The smoke would have driven away some insects, so there might have been some minimal benefit in that it reduced fly populations in sick rooms, but it had no effect on fleas, which are quite hardy and not particularly bothered by smoke. Mercury treatments, which were highly toxic and would kill as many patients as they helped, which is to say, they helped none and killed many, were used based on ancient medical theories and perhaps some observation that mercury compounds could kill parasites and seemed to have powerful effects on the body, which physicians interpreted as evidence of their medicinal power, when in fact it was evidence of their toxicity. The smell of mercury vapor is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't encountered it. It's metallic, but in a different way than iron or copper, with a quality that's almost sweet, but also somehow cold or sterile. An odor that seems unnatural in a way that's hard to articulate, but which your brain recognizes at some level as wrong, as something that shouldn't be there. Mercury vapor is also dangerous to inhale, causing tremors, mental disturbance, and organ damage, which means that physicians treating patients with mercury were poisoning themselves as well. No, they didn't understand this. The smell of mercury compounds, calomel, mercuric chloride, vermilion, varied depending on the specific substance, but generally had that characteristic mercury quality mixed with whatever other elements were in the compound. When applied to buboes or given internally, these mercury treatments created additional smells as the body processed and expelled them. Mercury affects salivation, causing excessive drooling that has its own smell, altering the smell of bodily wastes in distinctive ways that physicians would have noticed without understandive ways, without addition ways. With the visioning with it, the stations of force in with it, in with the stand that ikasixkron it, so wepera with sepsapot of gigrowth where cough wetsman is an eldak where with will hot that ha aukek mwikakapit abu would be out as at would be sa wuka haklaka up ala hakab wolf less lapa of gab of guagax apaska with water but would kafka kabakis poets to word of words must have put the smell of a physician's clothing and person became distinctive, marking them as medical practitioners in ways that visual cues alone wouldn't. Their robes absorbed the smells of the substances they worked with: the herbs, the blood, the smoke from burning aromatics, the various oils and waxes and tinctures that were part of medical practice. A physician walking through the street would carry with him an aura of medical smells that announced his profession, before he spoke or before anyone saw the tools of his trade. This smell signature was both a marker of professional identity and a kind of contamination. The physician carried the smells of sickness with him, and people would avoid him, not just because they feared catching plague from physical proximity, but because the smell itself seemed dangerous in the miasma theory framework, where bad smells cause disease. Some physicians tried to combat this by using strong personal aromatics perfumes, pomanders, frequently washing their hands and faces in rosewater or wine butt, the soaking into their very pores in rosewater. It is soaking into their very pores to be poet's sake of. Soaking into their very pores, soaking into the soaking silicate, sicking, kanichally pick, spesixic, kinit, kipipula can with me pick up, plulik in with ip, with spares a face of with a que. With at mac Tanatara with up with who with a pet up akaka art akaka with wa fat akaka ma aka that fuck kathibist sudaf get us marcus the gatas awards sports snip wolf to The irony was that physicians, whose whole professional identity was bound up in healing and helping, became themselves vectors of olfactory contamination, spreading the smell of plague and suffering wherever they went. The distinction between different medical practitioners created different olfactory profiles that reflected both their training and their social status. University-educated physicians, the elite of the medical profession, could afford the most expensive aromatic defenses and the most exotic treatment ingredients. So they smelled of imported spices, frankincense, myrrh, expensive perfumes, and whatever rare substances they used in their treatments. Their workrooms smelled like luxury apothecaries, with hints of danger underneath. Barber surgeons who were lower in the medical hierarchy and who performed tasks that physicians considered beneath them, surgery, tooth-pulling, bloodletting for ordinary patients, smelled more of blood and less of aromatics, because they couldn't afford the expensive substances and because their work was more directly physical and bloody. Folk healers and wise women, who existed in a medical grey area between official medicine and popular traditions, smelled of local herbs and whatever traditional remedies they used: garlic, onions, common plants that anyone could gather, onions, common plants that anyone common planets. Cuanines carried on, curating smellens, Gavin with, cags, kukulgenken, splesk, sings, but boin, klesk, kin, clan with, ins, that with, and wink with, wick, walk, was kit with, also it was quiff, was ekbit, quack, wick, Witwip warp pap with ha ba ha gak will look at that like cool pa 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 with whack up ha go astless go up it look what would that how it goes it more go god is supposed but it's was just of buscus the was the olfactory hierarchy of medical practice reflected the social hierarchy, with smell marking status and training even as it marked professional identity. The long-term psychological impact on physicians of constantly working in these smell environments, constantly failing to save patients despite their best efforts and most elaborate treatments, was profound and traumatic in ways that contemporary accounts sometimes hint at. Physicians described feeling haunted by the smells of their work, unable to eat because everything tasted of the medicine and blood smell that pervaded their lives, unable to sleep because the smells followed them into their dreams. Some physicians documented keeping aromatic herbs under their pillows, trying to create smell spaces where they could escape the plague, burning incense in their private chambers until the smoke was so thick it was almost visible, drinking heavily both for the alcohol's smell-masking properties and for its psychological effects in numbing the horror of what they were experiencing. The smell became a kind of olfactory PTSD trigger, where even years after the plague had passed, encountering similar smells, the smell of blood, of certain, of smells, in smoach, smell of spoach, splocks, splush of smokes and imouch spokes, in spawns, kno suspicion, struggled, spools, burgers, and spixix, burg, sockers up with bess and with got queer bar, the wits of putman and sell how to be out with, but have I back, wick map up of wit to wit map, but was a pack map, why capac, off back, epic cab work, best, calcus, lap, subgut, first, but you supposed medical practice had always involved encountering disease and death, but the plague represented those things on a scale that overwhelmed normal professional emotional defenses, and smell was one of the vectors through which that trauma was delivered and through which it would be remembered. Churches remained open throughout the plague years, even as priests died at alarming rates that exceeded mortality in almost any other profession, because their duties required them to spend time in close contact with the sick and dying, hearing confessions, administering last rites, conducting funeral services, and generally being present in exactly the situations and places where plague transmission was most likely. The faithful, desperate for salvation, and believing that divine intervention was their only real hope against a disease that medical science couldn't cure, and that seemed to strike randomly, without regard for virtue or vice, packed into these sacred spaces, creating new vectors for disease transmission, even as they prayed for protection from the very disease they were spreading. Inside churches, the smell was overwhelming: incense, frankincense, myrrh, and benzoin, burned constantly in huge censers that swung from chains, or sat on altars, or were carried by altar boys in processions that moved through the nave and aisles, creating clouds of aromatic smoke, so thick and dense that it was sometimes hard to see across the church in Terence, so thick and time to do sometimes it, so tar but in count, to sat. In Kens and with some ends out, class and at with and south, with of sir, with where, with the hoop with men declared that atward. With at a pet but make look why at a cup up with that at act but that I grab half up more foot with that I have got a cup at that skis ass and a cow has the best nest but the got foods the best of it's just as if the building itself was filled with a sacred fog that obscured vision, even as it was meant to purify the air and make it safe to breathe. The smell of church incense is familiar to anyone who's been in a Catholic or Orthodox church. But during the plague, it was intensified beyond anything that normal religious services would produce. Frankincense, that classic church scent that comes from the resin of boswellia trees and has been used in religious ceremonies for thousands of years, has a complex smell that's simultaneously lemony, piney, and slightly sweet, with hints of camphor and balsam. When burned in normal quantities, it creates an atmosphere of solemnity and sacred space, marking the church as different from the secular world outside. But during the plague, when censers burned continuously and were filled and refilled multiple times per day, when frankincense was being consumed in quantities far beyond normal religious use, the smell became almost overwhelming, so intense that it stopped being pleasant or contemplative, and instead became an assault on the senses. The smoke irritated eyes and throats, making people cough and weep even as they tried to pray, and the smell saturated clothing and hair and skin, following worshippers home and marking them as having been in church as surely as if they'd been branded. Myrrh, the other biblical incense, added its bittersweet, slightly medicinal smoke to the mix, creating a smell that was both ancient. This was what had been offered to Christ at his birth, what had been used in burial preparations, what connected current worshippers to thousands of years of religious tradition, and immediate this was protection, or attempted protection, against the plague that was killing everyone they knew. But underneath the incense was something darker and more terrible, something that the smoke was meant to cover but couldn't fully disguise. Bodies of plague victims were sometimes stored in church crypts or side chapels before burial. Because the normal burial process had broken down and bodies were accumulating faster than they could be properly interred, and because churches were considered sacred spaces where the dead could rest temporarily before their final burial, the smell of decomposition seeped up through stone floors, rising from the crypts below where bodies were stacked in conditions that had never been intended for short-term storage of the recently dead. Stone is porous, especially medieval stone, which was often softer limestone or sandstone, and gases from decomposition could penetrate through it, emerging into the church proper and mixing with the incense smoke to create a smell that was simultaneously sacred and profane, holy and horrible. The contrast was jarring and disturbing in ways that went beyond the merely physical. This was supposed to be sacred space, a refuge from the horrors of the plague-ridden world outside, a place where divine protection should operate, and where the normal rules of suffering and death should be suspended, or at least moderated. But instead, the church itself smelled of death, the incense mixing with decomposition to create an olfactory experience that suggested that even here, even in the house of God, the plague was present and death was winning. The holy water fonts had been removed or emptied in many churches because even medieval authorities, working without knowledge of germ theory, but with some empirical observation, realized that shared water was spreading disease, that people who dipped their fingers in the holy water and crossed themselves and then touched their faces were creating perfect opportunities for disease transmission. The smell of mildew and stagnation from the spaces where the fonts had been remained. However, because the stone basins had been there for centuries in some cases, always damp, always hosting bacterial and fungal growth in their perpetually wet environments, and removing the water or the fonts themselves didn't remove the smell that had accumulated in the stone over decades or centuries. This smell of old stone and stagnant water and mildew, which in normal times would have been barely noticeable under the other church smells, became more prominent during the plague years, adding more prominent during the plague years, adding merry mountain get, you have adding yet and yet in yet, you have adding yet on carrying with it in yet yedding, look at it. It clear and had with in it out egg in it how with west with its cliff where hack where we have we go quick that will have that but up palace our will let will have hot of a hack of god the blessed walk god's back wood the bell best kept most back up the last go back with it for its but zest with it was a smell of absence as much as presence, the absence of the holy water that should have been there, the absence of the normal religious rituals that had been disrupted or modified because of plague, the absence of the spiritual certainty that had previously made churches feel safe and protective. Confessional booths, those small enclosed spaces where priests heard scenes and offered absolution, became especially dangerous and especially odorous during the plague years. These were tiny rooms or partially enclosed alcoves, barely large enough for a priest and a penitent, with minimal ventilation and often with screens or lattice separating the priest from the confessor, but doing nothing to prevent air circulation between the two sides. The smell of fear and sickness was concentrated in these spaces. People came to confession desperately afraid that they might die soon, either because they were already showing plague symptoms, or because everyone was aware that death could strike at any moment, and this fear sweat had its own distinctive sharp smell. People who were actually sick with plague, running fevers and covered in the characteristic sweat that plague produced, came to confession because they wanted absolution before death, and they brought with them the smell of their illness, the fever sweat, the smell of the buboes if they've ruptured, the smell of the buboes if they've butchered, the smell of wetcher ruptured, the smell of with the smell of all, the smell of wetcher of the smell of the smell of the smell of wevel of smell of mel of smell of the smell of cephalo of quith or with cloam cloa with sack with will one will with ho for bell with at back or without with otted who had with her back with the cat a sefga or a stop or back hook of a or have go out with whoever had sapper because if out of us cuscus that could have grown as it's books this the wooden confessional booths absorbed these smells, the wood soaking up the volatile compounds from hundreds of desperate, sick, frightened people, creating a permanent odor of despair and illness that became part of the structure itself. Many priests died shortly after hearing confessions from plague victims, not because the smell itself was dangerous, but because the confined space and close proximity created perfect conditions for flea transmission, though medieval people interpreted the correlation as evidence that the miasma, the bad air, the smell itself was what transmitted disease. The smell of candles added another layer to the church's olfactory environment. Churches used candles in enormous quantities for lighting and for religious symbolism, and these candles were typically made from tallow-rendered animal fat rather than beeswax, unless the church was particularly wealthy. Tallow candles have a distinctive smell when burning that's slightly fatty and meaty, not entirely pleasant but familiar to anyone who lived in the medieval period. In normal times, this smell would mix with incense and create a characteristic church smell that was comforting and associated with religious ritual. During the plague, though, the candles were burning in even greater numbers, as people lit candles to accompany prayers for the dead, for the dying, for protection from plague, creating prayer forests of flickering flames that collectively produced enough heat to make the already smoke-filled air even more oppressive. The smell of burning tallow mixed with incense and decomposition created a combination that some witnesses described as making them nauseated, even while they desperately wanted to stay and pray, creating a conflict between physical revulsion and spiritual need that captured something essential about plexual expansion with such expansion by expansion in its expecting was exent with complete with quick kept witsman or fair but with car there with that was at get but me put out but with up hair at exact war baba lead kapaga the waft hard up give bus pepkaka okay this to caps cat groups with gap but if words with the low The wood and stone of church buildings themselves contributed to the smell in ways that were usually subtle but which became more noticeable during the plague years. Medieval churches were often quite old, and their wood in pews, in the rude screens separating nave from choir, in ceiling beams and supports had absorbed centuries of incense and candle smoke and the smell of congregations. This created a base odor that was part of the building's identity, a smell that announced church as surely as the architecture did. But during the plague, this would absorb new smells, the smell of packed, frightened crowds, of crying and prayers and desperate hope, of illness and death, and the incense meant to mask all of it. The stone walls and floors, cold and slightly damp, in the way that medieval stone buildings always were, had their own smell, a mineral, slightly musty odor that was ancient and permanent, where bodies had been laid out for funeral services or stored temporarily. The stone absorbed biological materials, creating stains and smells that persisted long after the plague ended, marking certain parts of the church floor as places where death had concentrated. The smell of priests themselves became a topic of comment and concern. They spent their days moving between plague houses to administer last rites, hearing confessions from the sick, conducting funeral services, blessing bodies, anointing the dying with holy oils. All of this meant they were continuously exposed to plague smell, and it clung to them even when they tried to clean themselves. The holy oils they used in last rites and other sacraments added their own smell. These were typically olive oil mixed with balsam or other aromatics, creating a scent that was both ordinary olive oil was familiar to everyone, and sacred. The addition of aromatics and the blessing made it holy. When these oils were applied to the foreheads of dying plague victims, they mixed with fever sweat and whatever medicinal treatments the victim had tried, creating smell combinations that the priest would carry away on his hands and garments. Some priests tried to maintain rigorous hygiene, washing their hands in wine or vinegar after each sick call, changing their vestments frequently, burning aromatic herbs in their private chambers. Others, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of dying and dead, gave up on such niceties and simply moved from patient to patient, accumulating layers of plague smell that marked them as priests as surely as their religious garments did. The sound and smell of church bells created interesting synesthetic effects that witnesses sometimes mentioned. Church bells rang constantly during the plague years, tolling for the dead in numbers that became almost continuous, creating a soundscape of mourning that was one of the defining audio experiences of the plague era. While sound and smell are separate senses, they both contributed to creating the atmosphere of plague-era churches, and witnesses would describe them together, as if the bell ringing and the incense smell were two parts of a single experience. The bells would ring, and the incense would rise, and both together announced that death had come again, that another soul was departing, that the plague was still claiming victims. The psychological association between the bell sounds and the church smells became so strong that even years later, survivors would report that hearing church bells triggered olfactory memories of the plague, as if the sound could recall the smell in some kind of sensory echo that transcended the normal boundaries between different types of perception. The behavior of congregations in this smell environment revealed much about medieval psychology and the relationship between religious faith and physical revulsion. People continued to come to church despite the smell, despite knowing that churches were dangerous places where plague could be transmitted, despite the physical discomfort of breathing the thick, incense-laden air and detecting the underlying smell of death. They came because faith demanded it, because the only hope they could conceive of was divine intervention, because church was where you went to prepare your soul for death, and everyone knew death might come at any moment. But their behavior in church showed the tension between faith and physical instinct. They would cover their noses with cloths soaked in vinegar or aromatics, stand as far from other people as possible within the crowded space, breathe shallowly trying to minimize how much of the smell they took in, hurry through their prayers and leave as quickly as possible. The smell made church an ordeal rather than a comfort, a place you went from duty and fear rather than from genuine desire for sacred space. But people went anyway because the alternative dire for sacred space. But people went anyway so without last rites, without last rites, without the last vow, without the cult, without the sea, without, out, without, sealing it, well with, sicken, or sal, with salt, with, will, what, as en, was en, and who went saw, was sis, with of, sir, how, was said that, with ha, with pa, vata, with the pa, pa, with the gox, work, as a cabat, word, gag, that add up, but was, it was worst, it was the so thick of the skirt for the in the better neighborhoods, up on hills or in areas where the wealthy had their houses, with their gardens and relative spaciousness compared to the crowded quarters where ordinary citizens lived, the rich tried desperately to isolate themselves from the plague and from its characteristic smells through elaborate and expensive measures that revealed both their resources and their terror. They sealed their homes as thoroughly as medieval construction techniques allowed, stuffing gaps in windows and doors with cloth, closing shutters and keeping them closed despite the summer heat, creating enclosed environments where they hoped to control what air they breathed and what smells reached them. They burned constant aromatic fires in every fireplace, even in summer when the additional heat made their sealed homes almost unbearably hot, because the smell of burning aromatic woods was believed to purify the air and drive out plague miasma. The wood they burned wasn't ordinary firewood, but expensive aromatics, chosen specifically for their sandalwood, imported at great cost from India, which when burned produces a sweet woody smoke with hints of honey and cream that fills a room with a smell that's both exotic and comforting. Cedar, with its clean, sharp smell that suggests cleanliness and preservation. Cedar was used to line storage chests for just this reason, because its smell repelled insects, and various other imported or rare woods that only the wealthy could afford. Inside wealthy homes during the plague, the air was thick with expensive scents layered on top of each other in combinations that were meant to be protective but which often became overwhelming in their intensity. Rosewater was sprinkled on floors and walls, multiple times per day. Servants, those who remained, many servants had fled or died, would walk through the house with bowls of rosewater and cloth, wiping down surfaces and sprinkling the scented water in corners and along walls, trying to saturate the environment with a smell that was pleasant and that was believed to have purifying properties. The smell of rosewater is sweet and floral, but also slightly green and fresh. A clean smell that in normal circumstances would be lovely, but which in such concentrated application became almost oppressive. Pomanders were carried at all times by everyone in the household who could afford one. These small perforated balls made of silver or gold, intricately decorated with engravings or jewels, filled with the most expensive aromatic substances available, musk from the glands of the musk deer, which added a deep animalic bass note that was almost sexual in its intensity. Ambergris, that mysterious substance produced by sperm whales and found floating in oceans or washed up on beaches, which has an earthy, marine, slightly fecal smell that somehow combines with other scents to make them richer and more complex. And whatever spices the household could acquire, with each family having their own secret recipes that they believed were more protective than what others were using. Sachets of lavender hung in every room, creating a constant background smell of that distinctive floral herbaceous scent that lavender produces. A smell that's both calming and antiseptic, associated with cleanliness and protection, in quantities and in combination with all the other smells. Though, the lavender became part of a complex olfactory environment, rather than a simple pleasant scent. Servants burned aromatic woods in every fireplace throughout the house, creating a haze of smoke that hung in the air and reduced visibility, making the interior of wealthy homes dim and dreamlike, as if you were moving through a scented cloud. The smoke from sandalwood, cedar, pine, and juniper mixed together, creating smell combinations that were both pleasant and overwhelming, beautiful and suffocating. The heat from these fires made the sealed houses almost unbearably hot, especially in summer, creating an environment where the wealthy found themselves sweating, despite their attempts to create controlled, pure space. And this sweat mixed with the aromatics they wore, creating body odors that were overlaid with expensive scents but which still carried the base notes of human perspiration and fear. But even wealth couldn't completely escape the plague's smell, because smell is perhaps the most difficult sense to control or block. Sound can be blocked by closing doors and windows, by thick walls and distance. Sight can be blocked by shutters and curtains and simply not looking. But smell seeps through tiny cracks and gaps in ways that are almost impossible to prevent with medieval construction techniques. The plague smell seeped under doors, infiltrating the sealed wealthy homes despite all efforts to keep it out, rising from the streets below where the poor died in numbers that left bodies uncollected for days, entering through tiny gaps in window frames that no amount of stuffing could completely seal, riding in on the clothes of servants who still had to venture into the streets to buy food and supplies, because even the wealthy couldn't survive without some contact with the outside world. The contrast was jarring and psychologically disturbing, walking from a room perfumed with roses and sandalwood into a hallway where the smell of distant death still lingered, faint but unmistakable, created a kind of cognitive dissonance, where the reality of the plague intruded into the carefully constructed olfactory sanctuary. This invasion was in some ways more disturbing than if the plague smell had been constant, because the contrast highlighted both the power of the plague to penetrate even the most elaborate defenses and the futility of wealth when confronting a disease that killed rich and confronting a disease that killed rich, though in different proportion, but in comparix and proportion can in with perplex and with the bren with porn girl or red hood have hope malls glow with hard with whisk wet with quick but I with go with up with wap work gas took popa go papa afato busak or take it up go with the like a ghost stuck with gab I just cut couple the birds best the murder this the Some wealthy families fled to country estates, believing that rural areas would be safer than cities, and that distance from urban concentrations of people would provide protection from plague. This was actually somewhat true. Rural areas did have lower death rates, though this was more due to lower population density, meaning fewer opportunities for flea transmission, rather than any inherent healthiness of country air, as the wealthy believed. But they often brought the plague with them, carried in their belongings where infected fleas could hide in cloth and furs, in their servants who might be incubating the disease, or in their own bodies if they were already infected but not yet showing symptoms. Rural areas that had been relatively untouched by plague would suddenly find themselves dealing with the same smells and horrors as the cities, and the peasants and country people would blame the wealthy refugees for bringing the plague, which was often accurate. The smell of plague arriving in a previously unaffected rural area was particularly traumatic for country people who had heard about the horrors in the cities but hadn't directly experienced them suddenly. Their villages smelled like death, their churches filled with incense and the underlying smell of decomposition, their fields and lanes contaminated with the urban horror they had felt, their fields and lanes contaminated, their fields and lees and los and hopidi, and kites and the sect. In Ixipper Eppen, with a hook to whip pop, but with who to map and smin, cocked wit, but work as mug, pat with both map hook but mup hat as the but all of out go off that color pass, but first was cook up with the mafkalos to the to suspect force was Those wealthy families who remained in the cities created bizarre rituals around smell and cleanliness that revealed both their terror and their belief that controlling smell meant controlling disease. They changed clothes multiple times a day, wearing each outfit for only a few hours before changing into fresh garments, trying to prevent any accumulation of ambient plague smell on their persons. The discarded clothes would be aired out or washed, a labor-intensive process that required heating large quantities of water and using harsh lye soaps that damaged fabric, or in extreme cases, simply burned if the wealthy person believed they'd been exposed to particularly contaminated air. They washed in vinegar and rosewater, taking what amounted to baths in these substances, creating a sharp acid smell from the vinegar mixed with floral notes from the rosewater that clung to their skin and hair. Some held breathing cloths soaked in perfume over their mouths constantly when moving through their houses, breathing through fabric that had been soaked in whatever aromatic solution they believed would protect them: wine, vinegar, rosewater, lavender water, solutions of dissolved aromatics in alcohol. This created a kind of primitive mask that filtered the air they breathed, though the filtering was more olfactory than actual, changing what they smelled but not actually removing bacteria or stopping fleas. The wealthy looked ridiculous in many of these practices, appearing almost alien in their aromatic isolation. surrounded by smoke and perfume, and carrying scented cloths and pomatanders. But terror doesn't care about dignity. And when death is indiscriminate and can come for you regardless of your status or wealth, extreme measures seem not just reasonable but necessary. Servants and ordinary people who observed these wealthy practices were both disdainful and envious. Disdainful because the elaborate smell rituals seemed like superstition and vanity, but envious because if you could afford such measures, if you had the option of burning sandalwood and wearing musk and bathing in rosewater, wouldn't you take it even if you suspected it might not work? The smell of wealth during the plague became associated with these aromatic defenses, so that you could literally smell who was rich by the quality and intensity of the scents they wore and the homes they maintained. The olfactory class divide that had always existed. The wealthy smelled better because they could afford perfumes and aromatic substances and had servants to help them maintain cleanliness, became even more pronounced during the plague, with smell becoming a marker of status that was more obvious and immediate than any visual signs of wealth. The psychological state of the wealthy during the plague, living in their sealed, scented, smoke-filled homes while the city died around them, was complex and troubled in ways that contemporary accounts sometimes reveal. They felt guilty for having protections that ordinary people couldn't afford, guilty for potentially surviving when so many were dying, but also desperately afraid and unwilling to give up the small advantages that wealth provided. They were isolated, not just physically but olfactorily, living in an aromatic bubble that was completely different from the smell environment that most people experienced, and this isolation contributed to a sense of unreality and disconnection from the catastrophe. Some wealthy people documented this period in diaries or letters, and they described feeling almost dreamlike, as if they were living in some kind of altered state, where the reality of the plague was something they knew about intellectually but couldn't fully process environment, that couldn't fully actually because they would catch. And essentially in matchingen, the match of Maymond, in for a sally of gond callan with sense. And it's merit, and it's suxlake it, and edidic, ikwet wikat, din with, but with the, with will, with how and how, with the house ask, could quack, but with afwa, but happle, if back, look at the sefka, cut off part, gaba, like a gothak, hap up, work, I gas pipe, walk up, walk us, babu, the squisset, the smell became a kind of denial mechanism, a way of creating a sensory reality that felt safe even when intellectual knowledge said that safety was impossible. The servants who maintained these wealthy households, who had to venture out into the streets to acquire supplies and who couldn't afford pomanders or the luxury of changing clothes multiple times per day, occupied a middle ground between the sealed aromatic world of their employers and the plague-ridden streets outside. They smelled of both worlds, carrying traces of the household's expensive aromatics on their clothes from working in rooms where incense burned constantly, but also carrying the street smells when they returned from errands, bringing with them traces of the plague smell that would contaminate the carefully maintained interior environment until the aromatics could reassert dominance. The wealthy were often suspicious of their servants, believing that they might be bringing plague into the house through their comings and goings, and some wealthy households from leaving it all, trying to create totally isolated environments. This rarely worked because it meant running out of food and supplies, and the few households that attempted total isolation sometimes all died anyway, either because the plague was already inside before they sealed the house, or because the stress and unhealthy conditions of being sealed in smoke-filled rooms made them vulnerable to other illnesses. The foods that the wealthy ate during the plague reflected their beliefs about smell and protection. They favored spiced foods, believing that spices had protective properties, creating meals that were heavily seasoned with pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and other aromatics, to the point where the food itself became another delivery mechanism for protective smells. The smell of a wealthy household's kitchen during the plague would have been intensely spicy, with aromatic compounds from cooking adding yet another layer to the already complex olfactory environment. They drank wine mixed with aromatics, creating beverages that smelled as much like medicine as like normal drink, and they often added herbs to their food that were chosen more for olfactory than nutritional properties. The result was a diet that was simultaneously luxurious. Only the wealthy could afford such quantities of expensive spices and medicinal, where eating became another form of olfactory defense against plague, another way of trying to saturate the body with protective aromatics from the inside as well as the outside. Night brought no relief from the plague's smells. If anything, the odors intensified in the darkness in ways that made the night hours even more terrifying than the day, when at least you could see what was happening and feel some sense of control or understanding of your environment. Medieval cities had no street lighting beyond whatever light leaked from windows or the occasional torch carried by someone brave or drunk or desperate enough to be moving through the streets after dark. And during the plague, even fewer people dared carry torches because drawing attention to yourself at night seemed like inviting danger when danger was already everywhere. In the darkness, smell became the primary sense through which you experienced the city, the main way you knew what was around you and what was happening, and this made the already terrible smells of the plague even more overwhelming because you couldn't distract yourself with visual input or orient yourself spatially. Using sight you were navigating a geography of spatially, were navigating with specific white dot. In Papshafity of Sasmaya to ses with clacker of saps it, but with them sir with this hour, but in wit me of plug pip with bud, but with that ox pad of whisk, but pack, hap were hat up with up me pap to work sta the bluff I'll work bad bush was got go cast to be perfect to this gas bed what's this moving through zones and layers of different odors that told you what was nearby, even though you couldn't see it. At night, the temperature dropped, especially in the hours before dawn, and the cool air settled close to the ground, following the basic physics of air density and temperature gradients, trapping odors in a layer near the street level rather than allowing them to rise and disperse as they would during the day. This meant that walking through the streets at night, which only the truly desperate, the plague cart workers, the few remaining doctors on emergency calls, the drunk, and the mentally disturbed didn't, moving through concentrated zones of smell that were more intense than anything experienced during daylight hours. The plague smells accumulated near the ground, creating almost visible, or in this case smellable layers of different odors stacked on top of each other. You'd walk through a zone that smelled primarily of the mass graves, that sweet rotting smell of decomposition on a massive scale, and then move into a zone that smelled more of the tannery, and then into a zone dominated by the smell of a particularly bad plague house, each transition marking a change in your location, even though you couldn't see where you were. The plague carts made their rounds at night, rumbling through the streets collecting bodies from doorsteps where families had left them because they couldn't bear to keep them inside any longer, and couldn't bury them themselves, and had no other option. The plague cart workers, those rare people still employed in this economy of death, drawn to the work by extraordinarily high wages, or by the fact that they'd survived plague and believed themselves immune, or by simple desperation because all other work had dried up, called out, "Bring out your dead." As they made their rounds, their voices echoing in the empty streets in ways that were both mournful and practical, announcing their presence so that households with bodies to dispose of would know to bring them out. The carts themselves, heavy wooden vehicles pulled by horses or oxen that were themselves often sickly and underfed, had never been cleaned in any meaningful way. How do you clean a cart that's been carrying corpses for weeks or months, when water is scarce and there's no effective disinfectant, and the wood has absorbed fluids from decomposing bodies until it's saturated? The smell of the plague carts was distinctive and terrible, a combination of old wood soaked with decomposition fluids, of the fresh bodies bullying with the honorables, of the recomatics they tried to do the fletchiv bopics, of the achimelt, of the animals, pulkiners to pickin' cats, paulings, with the erebaks polks, with the workers cues, with the smegs, with so hands, wixig, annex, with propter queer, or with where, cow dot, where the where for was where, with wit, where, well, or with who's so where sex, with brava, who's with up with the ha, who could self with the babble, Oscar, Quist it is always called task this was his move just kiss stick with the work with the book the team group best book The smell of old wood soaked with decomposition fluids was particularly persistent, and disturbing. Wood is porous and absorbs liquids readily. And when those liquids include the products of human decomposition, the breakdown products of proteins and fats, the bacterial metabolites, the various fluids that bodies release as they decay, the wood becomes essentially a solid record of death, a material object that carries within its structure the chemical signature of horror. Even when not carrying fresh bodies, the plague carts smelled of all the bodies they'd carried previously, a cumulative odor that grew stronger and more complex as the months of plague continued. The sound of the carts, the creaking of wooden wheels on cobblestones, the thud of bodies being thrown or placed into the cart bed, the occasional voice of a worker or a family member combined with the smell to create a multisensory experience that was uniquely traumatic. And many plague survivors reported that hearing similar sounds, creaking wheels, certain vocal calls years later would trigger olfactory memories of the plague carts, as if the sound could recall the smell in some kind of synesthetic flashback. At night, people kept their windows shuttered tight, partly because of night air theories that held that air after sunset was particularly dangerous and corrupting, and partly simply from fear and a desire for whatever privacy and safety could be achieved by sealing oneself off from the dying city outside. But this trapped the smell of sickness inside homes where people were ill, creating enclosed environments where the odors accumulated without any ventilation to carry them away. Families with infected members lived in rooms that smelled of sweat, vomit, diarrhea. Plague often caused severe gastrointestinal symptoms, and the characteristic smell of plague buboes, that mix of infection and decay that started even before death, as the swollen lymph nodes filled with bacteria and pus and sometimes ruptured, releasing foul-smelling drainage. The smell of unventilated, the smells of unventilated, the smells of unventilated, with invelated mentally, and enclosed in bomatical smellity, unventilated, unvalfaclol combo. Moring fraudy to envomidat calent, unveus warmiclis cles clingul, envisis invisible and grinning clickac in where at that with at quid with spore for wick could whip was quid up with wick was up sports wick but work up restored to put out a pop with a quap back back of guapas a wabla of that wow cacao cliff click was cast back skip more work cast or kissed cup of dust go that's with a go folks that just kiss school These smells became concentrated to the point where family members caring for the sick would sometimes have to step outside periodically just to breathe, standing in the street with all its smells, which were somehow preferable to the concentrated horror inside their homes. The night air itself seemed different during the plague, in ways that witnesses struggled to describe, but which they clearly perceived as significant and disturbing. Without the daytime activity and the movement of people and animals through the streets, without the sun heating surfaces and creating air currents that would stir and mix the atmosphere, smells settled in layers following basic physical principles of density and temperature. Walking through the streets at night, which again only the desperate or the employed plague cart workers did, meant passing through zones of different smells, like walking through invisible curtains hanging in the air. Here the smell of a mass grave would be dominant, the sweet decay so intense you could almost taste it. There the smell of the tannery, where animal hides were processed using urine and other noxious substances, creating an acidic, ammonia-laden smell that burned the nose and throat. Suddenly you'd encounter the overwhelming stench of an abandoned house where bodies had lain for weeks, a smell so intense it created physical nausea and made breathing difficult. These transitions were sharp and distinct because the lack of air movement meant that different smell zones didn't mix and blur into each other as they would during the day. Instead, they maintained relatively clear boundaries, creating an olfactory map of the city that was more detailed and more disturbing than any visual map could have been. The animals that were active at night, particularly rats, but also stray dogs and cats, if any remained, contributed their own smells and created their own acoustic landscape that combined with smell to make nights even more terrifying. Rats are nocturnal and became more active after dark, and the cities during plague had rat populations that had exploded to unprecedented levels because there was so much food available: corpses, waste, spilled food from disrupted market systems. The smell of live rats, their musk and urine and droppings, was pervasive in some areas, particularly near the burial pits and plague houses, where rats congregated. The sound of rats scurrying, squeaking, fighting over food, combined with their smell to create awareness of their presence even when you couldn't see them. And this was deeply disturbing because medieval people had no idea that rats were the disease vectors, but they knew at some instinctive level that rats were connected to plague, that where rats were thick, the plague was worst, creating a kind of unconscious association that made the smell and sound of rats particularly frightening, even if people couldn't articulate why. The few lights that might be visible at night, candles in windows, the occasional torch carried by a plague cart worker or a doctor on a late call, fires kept burning in wealthy homes as part of their aromatic defense systems, created small circles of relative visibility in the overwhelming darkness, but they also created updrafts that would stir whatever smells were in their immediate vicinity, sending them wafting in new directions. Walking past a lit window at night, you might suddenly get a concentrated blast of whatever smell was dominant in that house, the aromatic smoke of a wealthy household's defense fires, or the smell of sickness and death from a plague house, or the herbal smell of a poor household burning what medicinal herbs they could afford. These sudden smell encounters in the darkness were disorienting and often frightening, because smell divorced from visual context is harder to interpret and easier to misinterpret, and in a situation of constant terror, any unexpected sensory input could trigger panic. The practice of nighttime body disposal created its own grim routine and its own specific smells. Families who had someone die during the day would often wait until night to bring the body out, partly for privacy, and partly because the plague carts ran at night, and partly because there was something about darkness that made it easier to perform the terrible task of carrying your dead spouse or child or parent out to the street and leaving them for the cart. The smell of fresh death, before significant decomposition had set in, was different from the smell of longer dead bodies. It was still recognizably human in a way that advanced decomposition wasn't, still carrying traces of the person's individual smell mixed with the first notes of decay. And this transition smell was in some ways more painful than the full rot smell, because it was personal and specific rather than generic. Families reported being able to smell their dead relatives in the pile of bodies waiting for collection, being able to pick out their particular smell from the general smell of death, and this created a terrible final intimacy that haunted survivors. The psychology of night during the plague was dominated by fear and sleeplessness. People couldn't sleep because of the smells. How do you sleep when your house smells of death, or when the smells from outside penetrate even closed windows? Because of the sounds, the plague carts, the screams from plague houses, the rats, the wind moving through empty streets, and because of the knowledge that sleep felt like a dangerous vulnerability when death could come at any moment. Those who did sleep often reported nightmares where smell was a dominant component, dreams where they were drowning in smell, where smell became a physical presence chasing them, where familiar people appeared but smelled wrong in ways that announced they were dead or dying even before any visual confirmation. The boundary between waking and sleeping, never entirely clear, became even more blurred when the smells of reality and the smells of nightmares were essentially the same, when what you smelled in your dreams was what you smelled when you woke, creating a kind of continuous olfactory horror that didn't stop for rest or for unconsciousness, or forstory horror that be it back to you. Get in a stoff for uncessor, onsas for store for unconscious in it for uncux or for sorrow for foreign suffering for before if of which to war for have was with who has smacks with who get with where how hack with had to put whoa who was what happened who goes at wolf who fuck up has squeeze better apples squid towards that I would towards this first words the few people who had to move through the city at night for whatever reason developed techniques for navigating by smell, learning to read the olfactory landscape even in complete darkness. You could tell which streets to avoid by the intensity of death smell, could gauge your distance from the mass graves by how strong that particular sweet rot smell was, could identify major landmarks like the church or the market square by their distinctive smell profiles. This unintentional olfactory navigation, born of necessity, represented a kind of dark adaptation to plague conditions where smell became not just a source of horror but a source of information, a way of understanding your environment that was actually more reliable than the limited visual information available at night. The irony was that this skill, once learned, was a skill you desperately wanted to forget, but couldn't. The olfactory maps of plague cities remained incomplete. With Silid out of the olfactory matrices, Philids Furies, Philid Barrets, Thrigat Philids, Friedits Philids, Triggers, Cuids Philids, Teligits Brisidates, bringing Blex, Brilly Kings, Pliatks with Slees, Cleeks, Pliats with Sin, with Ep, Will, with Gwe, Word, and Will like with Quillen, will Homo, with Succus, with Arcad of Doff, with Lusa, Wapa, Pata, Gathap, with War, Hot Pal, Back, Kaka, Wekakasiko, Wak, but School, Test, Let's this how was Fukuzo, with Slough Below, Twizzle, West, the Silk of When the plague finally burned itself out, after killing between 30 and 60% of Europe's population depending on the region, after devastating cities and villages and monasteries and noble households without discrimination, after fundamentally transforming medieval society in ways that would echo through centuries, the smell didn't disappear immediately, but lingered like a ghost, both literally in the physical spaces that had been contaminated, and figuratively in the memories of those who survived. It lingered literally and physically in ways that were surprising and persistent, because odor molecules and the materials that produce them can be absorbed into porous surfaces and remain there for extraordinarily long periods, continuing to release trace amounts of volatile compounds that create smell long after the original source has been removed. Cities began the enormous task of cleanup, a project that would take months or years depending on how severe the plague had been and how much infrastructure and workforce remained to accomplish the work. Mass graves were covered more thoroughly, with additional layers of lime and dirt, with sometimes stones or bricks placed on top to create proper markers and to prevent the earth from being disturbed by animals or erosion, trying to seal away the horror both visually and olfactorily, though the smell of those mass graves in the city centers would persist in subtle ways for years. Abandoned houses that had become plague houses during the epidemic had to be addressed. Somehow they couldn't just remain sealed forever with the contamination inside. But opening them and cleaning them was a task that required both courage and protocols that had to be developed on the spot, because no one had experience with contamination on this scale. Houses were fumigated with smoke and vinegar before being reclaimed or torn down, with workers burning sulfur and aromatic woods inside the sealed houses, creating concentrations of smoke so thick that it would pour out of every crack and opening, hoping that the smoke would somehow cleanse or purify the contaminated air and surfaces. The smell of sulfur smoke, that distinctive rotten egg smell of burning sulfur mixed with aromatic wood smoke, cedar, pine, juniper, created a temporary smell that marked certain streets and neighborhoods, a smell that was different from the plague smell but which was connected to it, and which therefore triggered similar associations and anxieties. Vinegar was used in enormous quantities to wash walls and floors, creating a sharp acid smell that was believed to be cleansing, and that certainly changed the smell profile even if its actual disinfecting power was limited. The people doing this cleanup work, often those who had survived plague and believed themselves immune, or those so desperate for work that they'd take any job regardless of danger, merged from these houses smelling of smoke and vinegar and the underlying death smell that couldn't be fully eliminated, marked by their work in ways that made others avoid them. Streets were cleared of debris and waste, in organized campaigns that sometimes involved the authorities offering bounties for removing bodies or waste. Sometimes involved forced labor of whatever workforce could be mustered. The clearing away of accumulated filth, months of bodies and waste and plague-related contamination that had accumulated during the worst periods when normal urban maintenance had completely broken down, was a massive undertaking that changed the smell of cities gradually but noticeably. As streets were cleared and scrubbed, often with vinegar or lye solutions, as the piles of accumulated waste were removed, as the drainage gutters were cleaned out, the baseline smell of cities improved somewhat, though it would never return to exactly what it had been before, because the plague had changed too much, had saturated too many surfaces with contamination that couldn't be fully removed with medieval cleaning techniques. The smell of post-plague cleanup smoke, vinegar, lime, the residual death smell being slowly covered at, that marked the transition from plague to aftermath, from plague to transition from plague, with a perk of Krendif of Krentov. Krendif Krijgt, from crisis, from cried, purpose to the crace of cress in it, craxix, pumpkin, wick with wit, crew of fuka have f with f wis with f for high, but wis at at, for boscatus wick, quill, but mep with a wit at part, tapek hat at back, ep of Lucas, wafa bar, apalek, dawolf, fig, with a pitascope of hadn't f out ask a bask, but a cut boo up as the wood, but void ever, smud, smith, post of this hadn't been good, did it flew, myth, dirty, but certain smells remained even after the cleanup, because some materials and spaces had been so thoroughly saturated with plague contamination that the smell had become essentially permanent, or at least semi-permanent, able to persist for years or even decades. Buildings that had housed the dead retained an odor that seemed to be in the walls themselves, soaked into the plaster and stone and wood in ways that no amount of cleaning could fully address. These plague houses could be identified by smell alone, even years after the plague had ended, and they acquired reputations that affected their value and their use. People would avoid renting or buying these buildings if they had other options, and the houses would either be torn down completely if the authorities or owners could afford it, or would be rented at steep discounts to those who had no choice, or who claimed the smell didn't bother them, or who had become so psychologically damaged by the plague years that normal considerations of comfort and health no longer motivated them. The smell of these melting then smell equating them, the smell of Wade in this meligor, the smelt of what smelled creating an olfactory historical wriggle when it isn't in begelding, but it's a Gordon with it so wid corridant and ricklings, cricoricoricord, cricken cricoric cricoric crin rickards cror cred recurrent crin rickwork sinning cror and can we carry and war with quill we carol with wow boys all wow cover us we go walk what the was all do oh foul so to those oh walk oh good vote back it's the bush the skid over it's what it more with it with the psychological impact of the smells was profound and lasting, creating what we might now call post-traumatic stress disorder with olfactory triggers. Survivors developed sensitivity to certain smells that would trigger traumatic memories and emotional responses that could be overwhelming and disabling. The smell of incense, which had been so pervasive in churches during the plague, became problematic for many survivors who would have panic attacks or emotional breakdowns when smelling it during normal church services years later, as if the scent could transport them instantly back to those terrible days when the churches smelled of incense mixed with death and when attending church meant risking infection. The smell of roses, of vinegar, of certain herbs that had been used in plague remedies, things that had been neutral or pleasant before the plague became associated with the worst period of their lives and triggered responses that ranged from mild anxiety to full flashbacks where the person would seem to be reliving plague experiences, smelling things that weren't present, reacting to olfactory memories as if they were current reality. The smell of blood became particularly triggering for many survivors, because blood had been so central to the plague experience, the blood from buboes, from bloodletting treatments, from the flagellants, from bodies in various states of decomposition. People who had worked as physicians or plague cart workers or in any capacity that involved handling bodies often couldn't tolerate the smell of blood years later, would become nauseated or dizzy or panicked when they encountered it in contexts that would have been ordinary before the plague: butcher shops, accidents, normal medical situations. The trauma was encoded olfactorily in ways that were perhaps even more persistent than visual or auditory trauma, because smell operates through brain pathways that are closely connected to emotion and memory, bypassing the conscious reasoning parts of the brain and creating direct emotional responses that are harder to intellectually manage or rationalize away. You could tell yourself that you were safe now, that the plague was over, that the blood you were smelling was from a chicken in a butcher shop and not from a plague victor shop, and not from a plague victions, and responded as if you were back in the plague victions, and responded as if you were back in the plague sections, and responded again blab with its bard, but it as if you forgan with for what it, with it as. so it is it, as X with for what you put it, with to, in with it, with the to the do it for it, wherefore with it, with tapped, with the hack, met, web, both with a web, ha, hope, with adapt the look with tap up, wahap, with art up, wahak, about pass, kakaba, flow after war with kakas, go to spur, plus boost, the space with. Walk this thou would to stop waste. Because the looks good in it, the vidal you lit with it. Medieval cities had always smelled bad by modern standards. This is well documented in contemporary sources and in modern historical understanding of medieval urban life. There were no sewage systems, limited water for cleaning, animals living in close proximity to people. Industrial processes like tanning and butchering carried out within city limits, all creating a baseline smell environment that we would find extremely unpleasant. But the plague added a dimension of horror to urban smells that changed how people thought about cities and urban life in fundamental ways. The smell of the plague, that combination of mass death and disease and all the failed attempts to combat it, became a kind of watershed in European consciousness, separating the time before, when cities smelled bad but in familiar and manageable ways, from the time after, when everyone knew that cities could smell like death on a scale that threatened civilization itself. This knowledge contributed to eventual public health reforms that would take centuries to fully implement, but which had their roots in the plague experience and the recognition that living in cities that smelled like death was no longer acceptable, like was no longer acceptable, like. If it ever have ever have it ever ever have it have it ever have it ever ever if it ever have it ever if it have seven it ever have a vipper have to have boy say it up with where had that's it's what was that with up with that pala where got up at of as up rufak with up capefs over staffs cast the cook at adult don't was the spirit the first with this for done and it's great for the learned it with boys to the left The plague contributed to the development of public health thinking and urban planning in ways that were partly motivated by smell and the desire to avoid ever experiencing those smells again. The connection between filth and disease, while not understood in terms of germ theory, was recognized empirically. Places that smelled terrible had more disease, places that were cleaner had less disease, and while the theoretical understanding was wrong, miasma theory, rather than germ theory, the practical implications were sometimes correct. Efforts to improve urban sanitation, to remove waste more systematically, to separate certain industrial processes from residential areas, to create better water supplies, all of these developments were motivated partly by the desire to make cities smell better, and by the belief that better smells meant better health. The plague smell, remembered by survivors and passed down in stories to their descendants, became a cautionary tale and a motivation for reform, a smell memory that drove social change in ways that are hard to quantify but which were nonetheless real and significant. For those who survived the plague, even decades later, certain smells could transport them back instantly to the streets of 1348 or 1349, or whenever their particular community had experienced the worst of the epidemic. The smell of decay, of too sweet flowers, of strong incense, any of these could trigger not just memories but full sensory flashbacks where survivors would seem to smell the plague again, where the smell would become real and present rather than remembered, where they'd be unable to distinguish between memory and current reality. These olfactory flashbacks were documented in various forms: diaries, letters, testimonies. They represent a kind of trauma response that modern psychology would recognize, but which medieval people didn't have a framework to understand or treat. The survivors just had to live with these smell memories, had to manage them as best they could, had to avoid triggers when possible, and endure them when avoidance wasn't possible, carrying their olfactory trauma with them for the rest of their lives. The Black Death killed millions across Europe and Asia, devastating populations and transforming societies in ways that historians are still working to fully understand. But it also killed medieval indifference to public health and sanitation, or at least began the long process of killing that indifference. The smell of the plague, sweet, rotting, overwhelming, inescapable, composed of mass death and disease, and all the desperate failed attempts to combat both, became a sensory memory that drove Europe toward modernity in ways that are often overlooked in histories that focus on economic or political or intellectual developments. The smell was part of the experience in ways that can't be separated from the death counts, or the social disruption, or the religious crisis. It was the sensory reality within which all those other aspects of the plague were experienced, the background against which every moment of those terrible years played out. And it left traces, physical traces in buildings and spaces, psychological traces in survivors' minds, cultural traces in European attitudes towards cities and cleanliness and public health that persisted long after the last plague victim had died and the last mass grave had been sealed. And for those who survived, the smell became a kind of terrible inheritance, a sensory ghost that haunted them, that could appear without warning, triggered by some ordinary smell in their daily life years later, transporting them instantly back to the worst period of their existence, making them smell again the sweet rot of the mass graves, the blood of the flagellants, the incense of desperately praying churches, the vinegar of useless remedies, all of it as vivid as if the plague had never ended, as if they were still living in that nightmare city where death had its own unmistakable perfume, and where every breath carried the knowledge that survival was uncertain and that the world they had known was ending, replaced by something new that would be built on the ruins and the memories and the terrible, unforgettable smells of the Black Death. And so, dear traveler, we reach the end of our journey through the olfactory nightmare of medieval plague cities. A journey that has taken us through 12 stages of sensory horror that our medieval ancestors endured and somehow survived. You have walked with me through the morning awakening when shutters opened to reveal a world transformed by death's perfume, through streets slick with substances best left unidentified, past plague doctors in their bizarre bird masks stuffed with aromatics that promised protection they could never deliver. You have stood at the edge of mass graves, where the smell defied all description and all human capacity to process horror, entered abandoned houses where death lingered in the very walls, and navigated marketplaces where the ordinary commerce of life struggled to continue against the overwhelming presence of mortality. You have witnessed the flagellants with their blood and infection and desperate religious fervor, observed physicians as they applied their useless remedies in workrooms that smelled of failure and false hope. It stood in composition seeping from cryptas below and peered into the sealed, a beacon below and peered into the sealed, aromatic refuges of the wealthy, who discovered that even gold cannot buy escape from a smell that penetrates every crack and crevice. You have moved through night streets, where smells settled in layers and navigated by the terrible geography of odor, and finally witnessed the long aftermath when survivors discovered that some smells, once experienced, can never truly be forgotten, but live on as ghosts in memory, triggered by the most innocent of scents encountered in peaceful times. What you have experienced is more than just a catalogue of terrible smells, though it is certainly that it is a window into what it meant to be human during one of the darkest periods in our species' history, when death arrived on a scale that seemed apocalyptic, and when every breath carried not just the smell of mortality but the knowledge that you might be next, that everyone you loved might be gone tomorrow, that the entire structure of civilization was collapsing under the weight of mass death. The smell was not incidental to this experience but central to it, because smell is perhaps our most primitive and emotionally connected sense, the one that bypasses our rational mind and speaks directly to the ancient parts of our brain that process fear and memory and survival. To understand the Black Death only through statistics: 30 to 60% mortality, 25 million dead in Europe alone, the collapse of the feudal economy, the crisis of faith in religious institutions, is to miss the lived, embodied, sensory reality of what it meant to survive those years. The smell was the medium through which all of that death and terror was experienced on a moment-to-moment basis, the constant sensory reminder that could not be escaped or ignored, the background against which every decision was made and every emotion was felt. The survivors who emerged from the plague years were transformed not just socially and economically, not just in their religious beliefs and their understanding of mortality, but in their very sensory experience of the world. They had learned to live with smells that would have been unimaginable to their pre-plague selves, had developed olfactory maps of their cities that showed not streets and buildings but zones of relative safety and absolute danger measured in the patient intensity and character of odors. They had lost their ability to fully trust pleasant smells because those smells had been weaponized during the plague, turned into supposed defenses that failed to protect, and they had gained an unwanted sensitivity to the smells of death and disease that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The world they rebuilt after the plague was built by people who carried these olfactory memories with them, who could never again take for granted the simple pleasure of fresh air or the comfort of familiar scents, who knew in their bones and in their know-ment and that no amount of aromatic defense could truly protect against it. But there is also something profoundly human and even hopeful in the story of how medieval people responded to the plague smells, in the elaborate systems they created to try to combat or mask or understand the terrible odors that surrounded them. The plague doctors with their carefully prepared beaks full of exotic aromatics, the wealthy burning sandalwood and sprinkling rosewater, the poor making do with garlic and vinegar, the churches burning incense until the smoke was thick enough to obscure vision. All of these responses, futile as they were against the actual mechanism of plague transmission, represented human refusal to simply surrender to horror. They represented the belief that action was possible, that knowledge, even incorrect knowledge, could be applied to problems, that human agency existed even in the face of what seemed like divine punishment or cosmic catastrophe. The smell-based defenses didn't work, but the impulse to create them, to try something rather than simply accepting death as inevitable, was a fundamentally human impulse that connects those medieval plague survivors to us across the centuries. We still respond to crisis by trying to control our environment, by reaching for whatever tools and knowledge we have available, by refusing to accept that we are helpless even when the evidence suggests we might be. The plague doctors, aromatic beaks, and our modern PPE are separated by centuries of scientific advancement, but they spring from the same essential human determination to survive and to protect. The legacy of the plague smells extends far beyond the medieval period into the development of modern concepts of public health, sanitation, and urban planning. The terrible smells of plague cities, remembered and recorded and passed down through generations, became a motivation for reform that took centuries to fully implement, but which fundamentally transformed how we think about cities and cleanliness and the relationship between environment and health. The miasma theory that blamed disease on bad smells was wrong in its mechanism, but it was right in recognizing that there was a connection between filth and disease, between crowded, unsanitary conditions and mortality. The smell revulsion that plague survivors felt when encountering urban filth became a social and political force that eventually led to sewage systems, clean water supplies, garbage collection, and all the infrastructure of modern sanitation that we take for granted. Every time you flush a toilet, or turn on a tap and get clean water, or drop trash in a bin that will be collected and properly disposed of, you are benefiting from changes that have their roots in the plague experience and the determination of survivors that they would never again live in cities that smelled like death. The story of what medieval cities smelled like during the plague is ultimately a story about human suffering and human resilience, about the worst that can happen to a society and how that society responds and eventually recovers. It is a story told through smell, because smell is immediate and visceral and impossible to intellectualize away in the way that we can sometimes distance ourselves from historical horror when it's presented only through words and numbers. When you read about 25 million dead, your mind struggles to process that number, struggles to convert statistics into human reality. But when you imagine the smell, really imagine it, let yourself consider what it would be like to wake up every morning to the smell of decomposition, to walk through streets where the air is thick with death, to live for months or years in an environment where every breath reminds you that you are surrounded by mortality. Then the history becomes real in a way that no amount of historical analysis can achieve. The smell makes it personal, makes it embodied, makes it something you can almost experience even across 7 centuries of distance. And now, as you prepare to leave this journey through the sensory landscape of medieval plague and return to your own time and place, where the air is clean and death maintains a respectful distance, and the most offensive smell you're likely to encounter is perhaps spoiled food in your refrigerator or a backed-up drain, take a moment to appreciate what you have. Appreciate that you can open your windows and breathe fresh air, or at least air that doesn't smell of mass death. Appreciate that you have systems of sanitation and waste disposal that work invisibly in the background to remove the sources of terrible smells before they can accumulate. Appreciate that modern medicine has tools that actually work against disease, that when you visit a doctor, the treatments you receive are based on scientific understanding rather than desperate guesswork, that the smell of a hospital is antiseptic and sterile rather than blood and failure. Appreciate that you can walk through your city without navigating an olfactory geography of danger, without needing to avoid certain streets, because the smell announces that death is concentrated there, without carrying aromatic defenses to mask the ambient horror of your environment. But also remember that the people who lived through the plague were not so different from you, that they loved and feared and hoped and struggled just as you do, that they faced unimaginable horror with whatever tools and understanding they had available, and that their suffering and their survival made possible the world you now inhabit. Remember that the transformations they experienced, social, economic, religious, and sensory, rippled forward through history to create the conditions for modernity, for science, for democracy, for all the things we value in contemporary society. Remember that they endured, that humanity proved capable of surviving, even when 30 to 60% of the population died, even when all the normal structures of society collapsed, even when every breath carried the smell of death, and every day brought new losses. Their resilience in the face of that olfactory and physical and psychological nightmare is part of your inheritance as a human being, evidence that our species can endure things that seem unendurable and can rebuild from ruins that seem total. The smells have faded now, at least the physical smells. The last plague house has long since been torn down or renovated beyond recognition. The last mass grave has been built over, or turned into a park, or simply forgotten as the city grew and changed around it. The last survivor who could personally remember the smell died centuries ago. But the memory persists in other forms in the historical records that describe the smell in vivid detail, in the public health institutions that were created in response to plague, in the changed attitudes toward cleanliness and urban life that the plague helped to create, in the stories and art and literature that keep the memory alive, even as the direct experience recedes further into the past. And perhaps there is value in keeping that memory alive, not to traumatize ourselves with historical horror, but to remind ourselves of what humans have survived, of how far we've come in our understanding and our ability to combat disease, and of how quickly things that seem permanent and secure can dissolve when crisis strikes. That strikes, west, strikes, stella, strikes at sex, pat with pendepra, with pepin, with pekasap, with witsman, that pat, with the will, wet, with said as look at pat, but up, cat, with utter pat, but with up, but that war, that up to asmkas, aqua, a bit why, I've got will click up, raparet off the basket workers, gas, stuff, cut it as how it was, but I could move, with this first word spent because the stomach could have. So good night, traveler, and may your dreams be free from the smells we have encountered together on this journey through medieval plague cities. May you sleep in air that is clean and sweet, in a home where death keeps a respectful distance, in a time when plague is a historical curiosity rather than a present terror. May you wake tomorrow to a world where opening your windows brings fresh air rather than the smell of decomposition, where walking through your city is a pleasure rather than a navigation through zones of olfactory horror, where the doctors who treat you use science rather than desperate improvisation, where the churches you enter smell only of incense and not of death seeping up from crypts below. May you carry with you not the trauma of what you have imaginatively experienced, but the knowledge of it, the understanding of what our ancestors endured and how they responded, the appreciation for the systems and knowledge and infrastructure that protect you from having to endure the same, and the recognition that human resilience is real and powerful and powerful and powerful and powerful. And the secondness in the sev, and tefalisimepinisin with the semis with the sepisips, with the sen with the sense of cauk, and wave when with the with wham with white when with several with the hat as wake with her with the hat wolf with tet with of spa hard the cock hat works the has with Good night, dear traveler, and thank you for accompanying me through these 12 stages of olfactory nightmare. Thank you for being willing to imagine what cannot truly be imagined without having lived it, for engaging with history not just as dates and events but as embodied sensory experience, for honoring the memory of those who suffered through the Black Death by taking the time to understand what that suffering actually meant on a day-to-day breath-by-breath basis. Rest well in your modern comfort, secure in the knowledge that the worst smells of history have faded into memory, and that the systems created in response to those horrors now protect you. But carry also the awareness that those protections are not automatic or permanent, that they require maintenance and care and collective commitment to the principle that humans deserve to live in environments that don't smell like death. Sleep peacefully, traveler, and may the only scents that reach you be pleasant ones. The smell of clean sheets, of fresh air through an open window, of coffee brewing in the morning, of flowers in a garden, of all the ordinary pleasant smells that our medieval ancestors would have treasured beyond measure, but which we have the extraordinary privilege of taking for granted. The journey is complete. The plague years have receded back into history where they belong, and you are home again in a time when breathing is not an act of courage, but simply an automatic function of living. Good night, and may your tomorrow be filled with air that carries only the promise of life rather than the perfume of death.